A man knocks down a basement wall and finds a hidden city stretching hundreds of feet underground. A backyard walk turns into millions of buried gold, and road crews hit everything from dinosaur eggs to a perfectly preserved ancient body. These are unexpected discoveries found while digging underground. In 1963, a man in Turkey was doing some routine renovation work in his basement when he grabbed a sledgehammer and started knocking down a wall. The moment the wall crumbled, he saw something that he was never expecting to see. Behind the stone was a pitch-black opening, and when he followed it, he realized he wasn't just in a tunnel, he was in a massive underground tunnel leading to an ancient city called Derinkuyu. And when I say underground city, I really mean it. This was not a small cave or a storage room. It's a whole network of rooms and pathways carved directly into the rock, stretching hundreds of feet below the surface. The scale of the place, it's hard to wrap your head around. It had 18 levels, was built to shelter up to 20,000 people at a time. It had everything a real city needs to function: kitchens, stables for animals, chapels, and schools, all connected by these narrow hallways. It even had a genius ventilation system with shafts that channeled fresh air all the way down to the bottom levels. They used giant circular stone doors that could only be locked from the inside to block off intruders. For hundreds of years, the people living on the surface had no idea that this entire city was sitting right below their feet. In 2013, a California couple was taking their dog for a walk in their property when they noticed something strange sticking out of the dirt near an old tree. It was a rusted metal can, mostly buried and covered in grime. At first, they probably thought it was just some old trash that someone had dumped decades ago, but when they pried open the lid, they found gold coins inside. They went back to the same spot with a metal detector and started scanning the area, and before long, they were digging up 7 more cans. Inside those cans were thousands of gold coins, dating back to the late 1800s, all in near perfect condition. This is now known as the Saddle Ridge Hoard, and it was estimated to be worth around $10 million. Nobody knows for sure who put the coins there, but historians think a wealthy person didn't trust the banking system and decided to bury their life savings in the dirt. Obviously, it never came back for them. The couple had walked past that specific tree for years without realizing that they were stepping on a literal fortune. In early 2026, construction workers in Hull, England were in the middle of a routine excavation for a new water tank in Queen's Gardens when they hit something incredibly hard. They assumed it was a rock or some old foundation, but then they cleared away the mud. They realized they were staring at a huge cast iron cannon. It was over 8 feet long and weighed more than 2,200 pounds. It had been buried underground for centuries, and historians believe it dates back to the late 1600s. Back in that era, this area of the city was part of a major fortified dockyard. As the city grew and warfare changed, the old fortifications were torn down and the land was leveled to make room for new buildings. Instead of the massive back-breaking job of hauling that heavy cannon away, the construction crews at the time just dumped it in a hole and paved right over it. So it sat there for 300 years while the city transformed around it. When a company started construction on a new hotel in Alexandria, Virginia back in 2015, they were not expecting to find a piece of the high seas in their foundation. While they were digging out the dirt for the basement levels, crew kept hitting large curved pieces of timber. It looked like someone had just dropped a huge wooden frame in the mud. As it turned out, that was sort of the case. It was the remains of a merchant ship from the 1700s. In the 18th century, people didn't have the same environmental laws that we have today, obviously, and when a ship got too old, damaged to sail, it wasn't always scrapped or taken to a shipyard. Often it was just dragged to the shoreline and sunk on purpose. It filled the boat with rocks and dirt to create new solid land, which helped the city expand its waterfront. So over time, the city just grew out over the hulls of these ships. The one they found in Alexandria is remarkably well preserved because it was buried in wet, oxygen-free mud that prevented the wood from rotting. So archaeologists had to move at an incredible pace to dismantle the ship piece by piece, trying to preserve the wood before it just dried out and crumbled. A maintenance crew in Scotland was doing some routine repairs on the old Ruthven Bridge a few years back when they pulled a loose stone out of the foundation. Sitting in a small hollowed-out space inside the masonry was a metal box. Turned out it was a time capsule left by the bridge's original builders way back in 1894. Inside the box, they found a local newspaper from the exact day the bridge was finished, a handwritten scroll with the names of every worker who built it, and a bottle of scotch. It was a tradition for builders at the time to leave a little something behind for future generations, a way of saying we were here. While the paper and the scroll were gold for historians, the bottle of whiskey, that was definitely the prize. A literal taste of the 1890s, showing exactly how the drink was made more than 100 years ago. In 2015, road workers in Huiyan, China were in the middle of a standard job carrying up a street to fix a broken pipe when they hit this layer of hard, round objects. They're about to keep digging when they realized these weren't stones, they were fossilized dinosaur eggs. They ended up finding 43 eggs in that one single spot, and 19 of them were in near perfect condition, somehow surviving the weight of the asphalt and the traffic. Now, this specific part of China is actually known as a hotspot for fossils, but finding fossilized eggs directly under a busy city street, that was completely unexpected. You have to think about the people who drove over that road every single day. Thousands of commuters going to work or heading home were driving their cars back and forth over the remains of a dinosaur nursery. Back in 2011, road workers in Taizhou, China were widening a street when their shovel hit something wooden. They stopped the job immediately, and when the archaeologists arrived, they realized they'd found a coffin from the Ming Dynasty. This woman had been buried roughly 700 years before, but she hadn't decayed the way that you would expect. The coffin was layered, and when they opened the innermost box, there were more than just bones. Her skin was still soft, her clothes were perfectly intact. The secret was this mysterious dark brown liquid that the coffin was filled with. It acted like a natural preservative, sealing her away from the air. A man in the UK was digging a few holes in his garden to put up a new fence when he uncovered a heavy, dark rock that had a really strange texture. He pulled it out, set it aside, didn't really think much of it for a long time. He actually kept the rock in his garden shed for 16 years. It wasn't until 2013 that he finally decided to show it to a local expert, and the news he got back was incredible. It wasn't a rock at all, it was a vertebrae from a plesiosaur. These were massive, terrifying marine reptiles that hunted in the oceans during the time of the dinosaurs. They had huge heads, short necks, and 4 massive flippers that they used to zip through the water to hunt their prey. The specific bone he found belonged to a creature that would have been longer than a school bus. The fossil had survived millions of years, only to be found by someone trying to fix a fence in his backyard. When construction crews were digging in London to build the new headquarters of a massive financial firm, found something that completely stopped the project. The remains of an ancient Roman temple. It was dedicated to the god Mithras, a figure worshipped by this mysterious cult-like group that was very popular among Roman soldiers. His temple dated back to around 240 CE, and it's been buried under feet of mud and debris as the city changed over the last 2,000 years. It was preserved so well, they even found a wooden tablet with some of the oldest handwritten documents in London's history. And now you can walk through the ruins. They've been restored and integrated right into the base of the modern office building. So you can walk from a high-tech office lobby where people are like trading stocks on their computers and then directly into a temple that was built 1,800 years ago. Deep inside salt mines across Europe, miners have occasionally come across salt mummies. These are exactly what they sound like, remains of prehistoric people who were perfectly preserved by the salt in the walls of the tunnels. Because salt is so good at absorbing moisture, it pulls the water out of everything it touches. Even if someone died in a salt mine thousands of years ago, they can be pretty well preserved. Granted, they're like a dried out, leathery version of themselves, but they're not just bones. These finds are always startling because the clothing, the hair, their skin, and the tools they were carrying are often still intact. So when modern miners have been fortunate or unfortunate enough, depending on how you look at it, to come across these bodies, they often say they look like a person who's just fallen asleep. There's a bridge in Costa Rica that locals don't even bother calling by its official name anymore. Most people just call it Crocodile Bridge, and it's pretty obvious why. If you stop and look down, you'll see dozens of massive American crocodiles just lying there, stacked along the riverbanks and floating in the muddy water beneath the bridge. Some of these crocodiles are over 15 feet long. And they gather here because the river is warm and full of fish. Over time, it turned into kind of a crocodile hangout spot, and now it's one of the largest known concentrations of wild crocs anywhere in the world. Tourists regularly pull over, lean against the railings, and stare straight down at these ancient animals that could easily kill them in seconds. Edna Collins Bridge in Indiana looks harmless during the day. It's small, narrow, surrounded by trees, the kind of place you'd drive over without really thinking much about it, but once it gets dark, it's said to change. This bridge has been part of Indiana ghost lore for decades, and the stories around it are strangely specific. The most well-known legend says that if you stop on the bridge at night and honk your horn 3 times, something responds. People claim to hear a child laughing, calling out, or crying from beneath the bridge. Others say they've seen dark human-shaped figures moving under it, just out of clear view. Now, many people who grew up nearby warn newcomers not to do this, not in a joking way either. Some say their cars have stalled right on the bridge. Others claim their headlights dimmed or shut off completely while they were stopped. A few people say they heard movement under the bridge while sitting there, wet footsteps in the dirt. One driver said when their car finally restarted, the radio turned on by itself, blasting static before cutting out again. In July 2024, police in Bristol, England responded to a call near the Clifton Suspension Bridge, one of the most recognizable landmarks in the city. There, they found 2 abandoned suitcases, and inside were human remains. The bridge was partially closed while police searched the surrounding area, combing through the nearby paths and river access points to figure out where the suitcases came from and how long they'd been there. Clifton Suspension Bridge is a busy spot. Tourists take photos there every day, and yet someone managed to transport and leave 2 suitcases containing human remains nearby without being noticed. Well, after a few days, they caught someone, because it turns out this person was a total idiot. Through several CCTV cameras, they were able to track a guy named Yostin Mosquera. He'd carried the suitcases from London. In his apartment, they found the rest of the 2 victims, the heads of Paul Longworth and Albert Alfonso. They were hidden in his freezer. See, 2 days earlier, Mosquera had booked a van, loaded the remains into suitcases, and carried them to the Clifton Suspension Bridge. Passers-by saw him struggling with the bags as a dark red liquid leaked out. He told them it was just oil. And when one person tried to film him, Mosquera tried to grab their phone. So everybody just saw this guy doing that, and he just left the suitcases there. My God. In 2025, police in Brunswick, Georgia made a grim discovery beneath the Sydney Lanier Bridge. During an investigation in the area, police located skeletal remains of 2 people underneath the bridge. Investigators believe the bodies had been under the bridge for months, possibly longer. The location itself made things complicated. The area beneath the bridge is difficult to access, with uneven terrain and low visibility from above. It's the kind of place where something can just sit a long time without being noticed, even near a major roadway. As for who they were, how they ended up there, whether their deaths were connected or separate incidents, they don't know. Just last month, a 14-year-old case was finally solved though. Back in February 2012, a maintenance worker was doing routine work under an overpass in Chicago when he noticed something off in the gravel and weeds below the highway. What he found turned out to be human remains, lying under one of the busiest roads in the city. There was no ID, no personal belongings, nothing that told police who this person was or how long they'd been there. For years, the remains were unidentified, listed as John Doe, with no missing person matches and no solid leads. According to police, there was no obvious sign of foul play, but that didn't explain how someone could die under a major interstate and remain nameless for over a decade. That finally changed in January of 2026. When investigators turned to forensic genealogy. Illinois State Police said ISB special agents continued to investigate the matter in collaboration with the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, and recently submitted a DNA sample from a possible relative for comparison purposes. That sample turned out to be the break they needed. On January 20th, it confirmed the remains belonged to 64-year-old Ronald M. Reicher. They couldn't determine exactly how he died, but at least they have an identity. Back in 1978, someone renovating a house in Batavia, Illinois, tore into a wall and a skull rolled out. A human one. Last kind you ever want to see, really. Police looked at it and quickly realized it was old, really old. They couldn't figure out who it belonged to, though, so it ended up sitting in the storage for decades. But then in 2021, the Kane County Coroner's Office took another look at it using modern DNA testing. The skull was identified as belonging to a 17-year-old girl named Esther Granger. She died in 1866 during childbirth and was buried in Merrillville, Indiana. So, mystery solved. Well, there's still a big glaring question. How does someone buried in Indiana in the 1800s end up inside the wall of a house in Illinois? Well, it's likely that her grave was disturbed sometime in the late 19th century. Grave robbing wasn't really rare back then. Medical schools paid for bodies, and sometimes remains were taken and passed around to be studied. Somehow, at some point, that skull ended up inside a residential wall and stayed there for over a century. There's no clear record explaining exactly how it got there, but after more than 150 years, at least her name was finally put back to her remains. In Pontypool, Wales, contractors were doing renovation work on a house when they removed a false wall in a bedroom. Behind it, sitting upright in a chair, was a very pleasant sight. Only a mummified body. Turned out to be the homeowner, Elvira Stevens. She hadn't decomposed in a standard kind of fashion. Because the space behind the wall was sealed and dry, her body naturally mummified over time. Supposedly, a family member had concealed her body after she died. Investigators suspected it may have been done to avoid reporting her death to continue collecting pension payments. Instead of arranging a funeral, they just built a wall around her. Neighbors were led to believe she'd just moved away. No one realized she was still inside the house the entire time. In 2015, a homeowner in Topeka, Kansas started tearing down drywall during a renovation. Once the wall came apart, he noticed words carved directly into the wooden studs. And they were the kind of words that leave this nice, comforting, warm feeling in the pit of your gut. I see you. It seems like one of the Na'vi from Avatar was living in his wall. Is anyone gonna know about that joke? In like literally 2 weeks. All those Avatar movies come out, everyone forgets about them, and that it's I see you. If anyone remembers. Anyway, right under the message was a small drilled hole that went straight to the other side of the wall. The hole lined up with a private area of the house. The current homeowner had no idea it was there. The carving wasn't recent either. It had been clearly sitting there inside the wall for years, so someone had probably just been messing around, right? Well, it does get a little creepier. See, when reporters looked into the home's history, they found that a previous owner had been investigated in the past for voyeurism. Complaints had been made, but nothing led to any charges. A homeowner in Savannah, Georgia was doing attic renovations when they opened up a section of wall and found something packed inside the cavity, dozens of dolls. These weren't store-bought ones, though. They were stitched by hand, and when they were examined more closely, some were stuffed with animal bones and hair. A few had glass eyes sewn into them. These were like, real witch-type dolls. And they'd clearly been placed there for a reason, positioned and sealed in the structure of the house. But why? Well, Savannah has a long history tied to different spiritual and folk traditions, and objects like these sometimes show up in buildings. Items were occasionally hidden in walls for protective or ritual reasons. That part apparently isn't unheard of, but anyone from Savannah, Georgia in the audience will have to confirm that for us in the comments. What made this extra creepy was the number of dolls, though. It wasn't one, it was a collection. Homeowner contacted authorities because of, all the bones and hair in the dolls, but there was no evidence of a crime tied to them. Still creepy as hell. This isn't the only disturbing thing found inside a wall in Savannah, though. The Foley House Inn is a historic bed and breakfast built in 1896 in the heart of the city. In 1987, workers were renovating when they busted open a wall and found human bones crammed inside. The Foley House was built by a widow named Honoria Foley. Back in the day, a man staying at the inn became obsessed with her. She didn't reciprocate his advances, but the man persisted. One night, he just forced his way into her bedroom. Honoria, in a state of panic, grabbed a heavy candlestick, clubbing him over the head with it. Now imagine the position she's in. Late 1800s, a woman running a business, a dead man in her bedroom. Terrified she was going to lose her business, or even worse, end up hanged in the town square, she called a carpenter friend, and together they hid the body inside the wall of the house. People claim she admitted it on her deathbed in 1914. Well, then decades later, contractors tear into that same building and find the skeleton behind the wall. Since then, the inn's had a reputation. Yes, talk about a pale man in a top hat showing up in hallways in the garden. 2008, a woman said he shoved past her and disappeared. She followed the sound of footsteps that suddenly stopped near a wall. Staff later told her that was the same exact spot where the bones had been found years earlier. In 1984, workers doing routine maintenance in the Paris sewer system near the Pont Neuf, the oldest standing bridge in the city, ran into an animal. And it wasn't one any of them were happy to see. Moving through the narrow tunnels beneath the bridge, was a live Nile crocodile. It was about 31 inches long, crawling through the underground system below one of the most famous bridges in Europe. Paris isn't supposed to have crocodiles. The animal was eventually captured and taken to the zoo, but how in the hell did it get there in the first place? Investigators believe it was originally an illegal exotic pet, purchased when it was small, then dumped into the sewer system once it became too difficult or dangerous to keep. And that's where it lived and grew. The sewer tunnel stayed warm year-round, and the crocodile was able to survive for years underground. The Pont Neuf is constantly packed with pedestrians, traffic, and tourists taking photos. Boats pass underneath it every day, and yet beneath all of that movement, something completely out of place was living totally unnoticed. And speaking of things being unnoticed, beneath Las Vegas, underneath major bridges and roadways, there is a second city most tourists never think about. It's a network of storm drain tunnels, some large enough to stand up in, running under highways and bridges across the city. And for years, hundreds of people have lived down there. These tunnels were built to redirect flash flood water, but during dry months they become shelter. People set up makeshift rooms using tarps, shopping carts, mattresses, and scavenged furniture. It is very dangerous though. When it rains, water can rush through the tunnels without warning, and those that can't escape in time, well, it doesn't end well. Bodies have been found in these tunnels after storms, washed miles from where the water entered. There's a stretch of road near Inunaki Tunnel in Fukuoka, Japan that most people avoid at night. Above it, traffic moves as normal. Below it, decades of decay and abandonment hide something a lot more sinister. Urban explorers have found bones, clothing, and personal items sitting in the weeds and under concrete ledges beneath the bridges that run alongside the tunnel. In the early 2000s, volunteers combing the area came across bones. Some were later identified through police DNA records as belonging to missing persons. Some of the remains were decades old, others more recent. Next up is a story from Reddit, which goes as follows. So this happened yesterday, and I'm still kind of freaked out. I was walking my dog along the small creek that runs through our town. It sits right under an old concrete bridge near a park. I stopped to tie my dog's leash to a railing for a sec and noticed something sticking out from under the bridge. First I thought it was just a backpack someone left. When I got closer, I realized it was a bunch of small dolls, all dirty and broken, arranged in a circle on the ground. Some had their eyes scratched out. A few had weird little messages written on them in marker, like "don't look," "stay away," stuff like that. I froze for a second, thinking maybe some kids were messing around, but there was no one around. And then I noticed footprints leading into the water right under the bridge, like someone had been wading around barefoot. It didn't make sense. The creek is icy cold this time of year. I didn't touch anything. I just left and walked home. But the whole time I felt like someone or something was watching me from the shadows under the bridge. I'm definitely not going back there alone. And we're gonna finish this one off with a possible Sasquatch sighting that happened this past summer. This case comes straight from the BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. It was August 4th, 2025, a clear summer morning in Grady County, Oklahoma. Around 8:15 a.m., Jeff Powers was doing what he'd done almost every weekday for the past 3 years, driving north on Highway 4 bridge over the Canadian River on his way to work. Every time he crossed that bridge, he'd glance up or down the river. Sometimes he'd spot deer along the banks. This time, though, he saw a lot more than a deer. Down in the river, Jeff saw a huge black figure moving through the water, walking upright on 2 legs. The thing was wading across the river, heading north toward the bank, and what really caught Jeff's eye first was the wake. The water behind it was clearly disturbed, like something big was pushing through at a steady pace. The water came up to about knee level on the figure, and Jeff said the torso alone looked wider than a 50-gallon drum. It didn't have a hunched posture like a bear, but it had nearly jet black fur. It looked slicked down though, like it had just come up from the river moments before. Jeff crossed the bridge, his brain scrambling to make sense of what he'd just seen. He immediately turned around and looped back to look again, but by then the figure was gone. In one U.S. case that made national headlines, a family started hearing a faint buzzing coming from a bedroom wall. At first it was kind of subtle, but it got louder and it didn't really stop. Eventually they cut into the drywall to see what the hell was going on, and behind it was a massive beehive. Estimates put the colony at around 50,000 bees. The hive had grown so large that honey and wax was spreading through the wall cavity. The structure was starting to warp from the weight. Professionals had to be called in, of course, to safely remove the colony, because disturbing that many bees without protection would have been downright dangerous. Bees look for enclosed, protected spaces to build their hives. A hollow wall is basically perfect. Once they're inside, they can go unnoticed for a long time. In this case, the family had been sleeping just a few feet away from tens of thousands of insects living inside the wall. One of the most unsettling finds in recent years happened in a huge abandoned public building in Oakland, California. Construction crews were renovating the old Henry J. Kaiser Convention Center, a massive landmark, been closed for years. When workers were tearing down part of an interior wall, something really unexpected fell out of the gap. Although not unexpected by most Amazing Top 10 standards, it was human remains. Not just loose bones, this was a full body that had decomposed and essentially dried out right where it was found, caught in a narrow wall cavity. It was basically mummified. Over time, they were able to identify him, though, through forensic work as 44-year-old Joseph Edward Medjica, a man last seen alive in August of 2020. He'd been missing for more than a year. Sheriff's office later said there were no obvious signs of foul play or trauma, so they think he somehow ended up in that tiny space during the time the building was neglected and just died there. In Cleveland, Ohio, renovation crews working on a home discovered a concealed room behind a wall. It wasn't obvious from the outside. The entrance had been sealed over. Inside, investigators found chains attached to the walls and what appeared to be restraints. Police were called to inspect the scene. Given Cleveland's history, especially after the Ariel Castro kidnapping case was exposed in 2013, any discovery involving hidden rooms and restraints immediately raised alarm. If you've never heard of that case, by the way, a man named Ariel Castro kidnapped 3 women, Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina De Jesus, and held them captive in his home for about a decade. The victims were kept in locked rooms in his home, sometimes chained up. Castro was finally caught when Amanda Berry escaped and alerted neighbors. So in this case, a hidden room with chains in the wall was pretty alarming. The police investigated and didn't confirm the space was used for an act of kidnapping. The home had changed owners over the years too, and it wasn't really clear who built the room or when. When 28-year-old Emmy Brookman and her fiancé Norton Johnston bought their 400-year-old farmhouse in Lancashire, England, they expected a renovation. They didn't expect was to uncover bones hidden inside the walls. The couple bought the 3-bedroom property in February of 2023 and started renovations after discovering some issues. While chiseling away the old render near the front door, something popped out of the wall. Emmy said it was very obviously a bone. Over the course of the work, they found 6 bones in total, 4 in the exterior sections and 2 inside the wall cavities. One of the bones appeared to be the size and shape of a human finger, while the others seemed to come from animals. As they dug deeper into the house's history, they learned that hiding bones and odd objects in walls wasn't uncommon back in the day. It had to do with old beliefs about protection and warding off evil. Alongside the bones, they also found a small green bottle filled with ashes and herbs. Speaking of bottles found in walls, this next one is not a single case. It's well documented across multiple historic homes. In England and later in parts of the United States, people in the 16th and 17th centuries would hide what were called witch bottles under hearths, near doorways, and inside walls. Archaeologists have found them during renovations of old properties. These bottles were usually sealed containers filled with stuff like human hair, nail clippings, pins, bent nails, and sometimes urine. People believed these objects would trap or repel harmful spiritual forces.
In 2020, state officials were counting sheep from a helicopter when they spotted something that looked like it fell straight out of a sci-fi movie. Deep in the Red Rock Canyons of Utah's desert, a shimmering 10-foot tall metal monolith was found tucked away into a remote cove. It wasn't ancient, it was polished, triangular, and looked like it belonged in 2001: A Space Odyssey. There were no tracks leading to it, no signs of construction, and for days the world went into a frenzy speculating about its origin. Was it aliens, a secret government project, or just a very dedicated artist? Before the mystery could officially be solved, the structure vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only a triangular metal plate behind. It was later revealed to be a guerrilla art installation by a group known as the Most Famous Artist, but the sheer effort required to transport and bolt such a heavy object into solid rock in such an inaccessible location still makes very little sense to locals. If you're flying over the Egyptian desert near the Red Sea, you might think you're hallucinating a giant swirling portal to another dimension. Constructed in 1997, Desert Breath is a massive piece of land art consisting of two interlocking spirals, one of vertical cones and one of conical depressions. It spans over 1 million square feet and originally featured a central pool of water that has since evaporated, leaving a shimmering salt crust. What makes this so baffling to travelers is how perfectly preserved it remains in such a harsh environment, where shifting sands usually reclaim everything within months. It wasn't built by ancient civilizations or extraterrestrials, but by 3 Greek artists who moved 280,000 cubic feet of sand to create it. However, seeing such mathematical perfection in the middle of a barren wasteland often stops tourists in their tracks, wondering if they've stumbled upon an ancient landing pad or a modern mystery. There is nothing more nonsensical than seeing a massive fishing trawler sitting in the middle of a scorching desert miles away from a single drop of water. In the Munich desert of Uzbekistan, graveyard-like clusters of rusted ships sit upright in the sand, looking like they were dropped from the sky. This was once the Aral Sea, the 4th largest lake in the world, which supported a thriving commercial fishing industry for decades. Due to extreme irrigation projects during the Soviet era that diverted the rivers feeding it, the water vanished at an alarming rate, leaving a toxic desert of salt and pesticides behind. These ships didn't sink, the water simply retreated away from them so fast that they were stranded where they dropped anchor. Seeing these massive skeletons of the fishing industry baking in 100-degree heat is a haunting reminder of how quickly an ecosystem can turn into a surreal landscape that makes no geographical sense to a first-time observer. In 1998, a pilot flying over the South Australian outback looked down and saw a giant man carved into the earth, and he's over 2 miles long. The Maori man is one of the world's largest geoglyphs etched into a plateau in the middle of the Australian wilderness. It depicts an indigenous hunter with a throwing stick, and it is so large that it can only be fully appreciated from space. The mystery? No one knows who made it or how they kept it secret for so long. Despite its scale, no witnesses ever saw the construction, and no footprints or vehicle tracks were ever found at the site when it was first discovered by an unsuspecting charter pilot. The lines are 12 inches deep, and the precision of the proportions is staggering for a work of art that can't be seen from the ground. Even with modern GPS, creating something of this scale in the middle of nowhere without being noticed is a logistical nightmare that remains an unsolved puzzle to this day. In the Namibia desert, millions of circular patches of bare earth pockmark the landscape like a massive case of chickenpox on the planet's surface. These are known as fairy circles, and they stretch across thousands of miles of arid grassland, and for decades scientists couldn't explain why these circles, ranging from 7 to 49 feet in diameter, form in such a perfect repeating hexagonal pattern that resembles a honeycomb. They don't overlap, and absolutely nothing grows inside them, even when the surrounding grass is lush. Local folklore suggested that they were the footprints of gods or were caused by underground dragons whose poisonous breath killed the vegetation. Deep in the Atacama Desert of Chile, researchers found a 6-inch long skeleton with an elongated skull and 10 ribs instead of the usual 12. When photos first leaked, the internet was convinced that it was proof of alien life due to its extremely small stature and pointed head. The skeleton, nicknamed Atta, was found wrapped in a cloth in a deserted town and had teeth that were surprisingly well developed for its size. However, DNA analysis conducted years later proved that it was human, but the mystery shifted. How did a human with such extreme genetic mutations survive at all? And why did the bones appear to have the maturity of a 6-year-old? The discovery of such a unique biological anomaly in the driest desert on Earth remains one of the most bizarre finds in archaeological history, as it's still unclear how the body ended up in such a remote location. Imagine driving through the most desolate stretch of the Pan American Highway and seeing a massive 36-foot tall hand reaching out of the sand as if it was someone buried alive. This is the Mano del Desierto, a concrete and iron structure that looks like the final desperate gesture of a giant. Located 46 miles from the city of Antofagasta, this sculpture by Mario Iraazabal is meant to emphasize human vulnerability and the tragedy of injustice. However, for those who don't know it's there, stumbling upon a giant stony hand in a place where there are 0 signs of life for miles is a jarring, surreal experience. It looks like the remains of a buried titan from a forgotten era of mythology, and its isolation makes it a favorite target for graffiti artists who trek across the dunes to leave their mark on the hand of the desert. We've always known sand dunes move, but scientists recently discovered that one of the world's most complex dunes has been hiding its age for thousands of years. The Lalalia Star Dune in Morocco is a massive pyramid-shaped structure that towers over the surrounding landscape. Recent research using luminescence dating, which measures when the grains of sand were last exposed to sunlight, found that the base of the dune is 13,000 years old, but then it stopped growing for 8,000 years before rapidly shooting up in the last millennium. The nonsense part? Scientists couldn't figure out why it just stopped and started, or how these star dunes, which move in multiple directions, maintain their shape without collapsing during high winds. It turns out the desert has a much more complex internal clock than we ever realized, and these dunes are actually moving at a rate of 1.6 feet per year across the desert floor. In the 1990s, if you wanted to reach the most isolated person on Earth, you just had to call a specific number in the middle of the Mojave Desert. The Mojave phone booth was a hand-crank magnetophone installed in the 1960s for miners located 15 miles from the nearest highway. In 1997, a man found the number and started calling it just to see if anyone would answer, eventually creating a website dedicated to the booth. It became a global sensation, turning a mundane piece of technology into a cultural icon. People would travel for days just to sit by the booth in the middle of a wasteland and wait for it to ring, often answering calls from strangers across the globe. People from all over the world, Germany, Australia, New York, would call the booth just to talk to whoever was there, creating a bizarre social network in a place with no electricity or even running water. The last thing that you would expect to find in the middle of a scorching Egyptian Sahara is the skeleton of a whale, but here there are hundreds of them. Wadi al-Hitan, or Whale Valley, contains the highest concentration of Basilosaurus fossils in the world, perfectly preserved in the sandstone. But these aren't your typical whales. These creatures represent one of the most significant stages of evolution because they had hind legs with toes. Finding the remains of massive marine predators in a place that is now a sea of sand with wind-sculpted rock is the ultimate out-of-place discovery. It proves that the Sahara was once a massive, teeming ocean called the Sea. The sight of a 50-foot-long skeleton with tiny little legs resting on desert dunes is a visual contradiction that feels like a glitch in reality, making it the most incredible thing ever found in a desert.
In a lonely part of Kazakhstan, far from any major city, satellite images revealed something that looked almost unbelievable at first glance. A giant pentagram carved into the ground. It measures roughly 1,200 feet across, and from above it looks exactly like the kind of symbol people would expect to find in some forbidden or secret location. That is exactly what made it so creepy. This was not found in the middle of a city or beside some tourist attraction. It was sitting out in a remote landscape where almost nobody would ever randomly come across it. Even after explanations pointed to it likely being an outline of a Soviet-era park or star-shaped design, the image still feels deeply unsettling, because when you first see a giant pentagram in the middle of nowhere, your brain does not go to landscaping, it goes to cult, probably. In 2012, villagers near a remote Siberian settlement made a discovery that looked like it had come straight out of a science fiction movie. Deep in the forest, they found a huge metal object, weighing around 440 pounds, shaped like a cylinder with a strange ridged dome on one end. It was so unusual that locals believed it had fallen from space, and media quickly started calling it a UFO fragment. The object was dragged through the snow back to the village and handed over to authorities for inspection, but that only made the mystery stranger. Russia's space agency said it was not related to space technology. NASA's orbital debris chief said it did not appear to be from a spacecraft either, and tests showed it was not radioactive. Part of it was reportedly made of titanium, but no one could immediately explain exactly what it was or how it ended up in the middle of a Siberian forest. In Sudan's Bayuda Desert, archaeologists uncovered a roughly 4,000-year-old burial that stood out because of one deeply strange detail. Inside the grave, they found a ceramic vessel containing charred plant material, wood, animal bones, insect remains, and fossilized droppings, and researchers said they did not know of a similar case. That is exactly the kind of discovery that makes a site feel mysterious rather than simply old. It was not just a body buried in the desert, it was evidence of a ritual nobody fully understands in a place that today feels harsh, empty, and cut off from the rest of the world. The idea that a remote grave could preserve the trace of a ceremony we still cannot interpret adds a whole extra layer of unease. It makes the desert feel less empty and more like it's hiding customs that disappeared without explanation. High in the mountains of Mexico, in a cave called Chiquite, researchers found stone objects that could push human presence in the Americas much further back than many people once thought. What makes this discovery so weird is the cave itself. It's a barren, cold, remote cave, and it does not look like the kind of place ancient people would casually choose to live in for comfort. That is why the discovery hits so hard. You picture a place that feels difficult to reach even now, and then you realize people may have been deep inside it tens of thousands of years ago. It changes the mood of the whole location. Instead of feeling empty, it suddenly feels watched by the distant past. And when an isolated cave starts rewriting parts of human history, it stops being just a cave. It becomes the kind of place that makes the world feel older and stranger than it should. Deep in the Peruvian Andes lies a remote Inca site so difficult to reach that many people compare it to Machu Picchu's hidden cousin. One of the strangest things found there is not a temple or a tomb, it is a set of white stone llama figures built directly into the terrace walls. That image alone is unforgettable. In a lonely mountain complex surrounded by steep terrain, you suddenly find llamas marching across the hillsides in stone. Researchers have said there is nothing else quite like it in the Andes, which only adds to the mystery. It feels artistic, symbolic, and oddly playful, but also eerie because of where it is. These were not decorations in some busy city square, they were placed in a remote ceremonial landscape high in the mountains. On the remote Indonesian island of Flores, inside Liang Bua Cave, scientists uncovered the remains of a tiny human species now known as Homo floresiensis. The discovery became famous because the individual was so small that people immediately started calling it a real-life hobbit. But what makes this find perfect for a mystery list is not just the size, it's the setting. This was not some famous urban excavation site where unusual finds happen all the time. It was a cave on an isolated island, and inside it was evidence of a human relative that most people never imagined existed. In Afghanistan's Bamiyan village, towering Buddha statues were once carved directly into massive cliffs, standing watch over a remote landscape that now feels far removed from the Buddhist world they came from. The two giant figures, destroyed in 2001, were around 55 and 38 meters tall, and the surrounding cliffs also contain caves and remains of monastic spaces. That is what makes this place so striking. You are looking at a rugged valley in central Afghanistan, and then you realize it once held colossal, sacred figures visible to travelers moving through the region. One of the strangest archaeological discoveries in recent years came from an ancient port on Egypt's Red Sea coast. In that remote desert setting, archaeologists found a Buddha statue and what scholars described as the first Buddhist inscription found in Egypt, including the first Sanskrit inscription there. That is the kind of discovery that instantly scrambles your mental map of the ancient world. A Buddha in Egypt sounds wrong until you remember how trade once connected distant civilizations. But even knowing that, it still feels shocking. This was not a bustling modern crossroads, it was a remote desert port, and buried there was evidence that ideas, religion, and art had traveled much further than most people imagine. Near the Tigris Tunnel in southeastern Turkey, ancient Assyrian rulers had reliefs and inscriptions carved directly into the rock of a cave system associated with one of the sources of the Tigris. That is already dramatic, but the setting is what makes it unforgettable. These were not carvings made in a palace where crowds would admire them every day. They were placed in a wild, natural site deep in a cave landscape tied to the origin of one of the great rivers of history. Deep off the coast of Alaska, scientists using a remotely operated vehicle found one of the weirdest objects imaginable stuck on a rock on the ocean floor. A small golden orb with a hole in it. It was a discovery about 3,300 meters down in complete darkness during an N expedition. And the best part is that even the scientists on the mission were unsure of what they were looking at in the moment. That uncertainty is what makes this such a perfect number one. It was not ancient ruins or some half-understood monument from a distant past. It was a real object found in one of the most inaccessible places on Earth, and the immediate reaction was basically confusion. That is pure mystery.
In July 2003, at the Capri Motel in Kansas City, Missouri, a guest checked into his room and almost immediately noticed something was off. He told the front desk that there was this terrible, persistent smell. It smelled like something was dead in there, actually, but staff didn't offer much help. He stayed another day, then another, complaining about this stench each time. After 3 nights of not being able to sleep, eat, or even breathe comfortably, he finally gave up and checked out. When the housekeepers went into that same room to clean it, they ended up finding more than just a bad smell. As they lifted the mattress to change the sheets, they noticed the smell suddenly got even worse. Police were called in, and under the bed, hidden beneath wooden panels, was a man's decomposing body. Apparently, he'd been in there for several days. Well, this is a lot of our worst nightmares, especially for the ladies watching. In March 2025, a solo traveler from Thailand named Natalisi Taksisi was staying at a hotel in Tokyo. After spending the day sightseeing, she came back to her room in the evening, unlocked the door with her key card like usual, and started to relax. But then she noticed a strange smell that she couldn't quite place. She leaned down to check under the bed, and that's when she saw a man crouched there, staring right back at her. She watched in horror as he climbed out and stood there for a moment before leaving the room. Natalisi screamed. Hotel staff were called and police were brought in to investigate. They found a power bank and a USB cable under the bed, but there's no explanation for how the man got into the room or what he'd been planning to do. The hotel didn't have cameras in the hallways, so authorities had a hard time tracking his movements. Natalisi understandably switched to a different hotel for the rest of her trip. A few years ago, a woman named Addison Castle was staying in a motel with her grandmother when she noticed something odd. There was a cut in the carpet right under her bed. Curious, they lifted it up and found wooden boards covering an opening. When they pulled the boards aside, they discovered this dark, unfinished space under their room. It looked like there was an empty coffin under the floorboards. The motel was only 1 floor with no basement. In a follow-up clip Addison posted, she explained that there were no pipes or wiring down there. Again, to me, it just looks like a coffin covered in cobwebs. Now, that would actually be a great place to hide a body, just saying. Now, Addison filmed the discovery and posted the clips to TikTok. Viewers speculated about what it could be, everything from an old boiler room to a bomb shelter or a tunnel of some kind. No official word from the motel. This is a very recent case. Just this past January, deputies from the Harris County Sheriff's Office were at the Deluxe Inn and Suites in Channelview, Texas to serve a parole arrest warrant for a suspect from Louisiana. They found and detained the person the warrant was for, but then something else happened right next door. While deputies were there, they noticed a broken window in a different motel room. They got permission to check it out, and when they walked in, they found the body of a man in the bathroom. He had multiple bullet wounds and was pronounced dead at the scene. The victim was identified as 33-year-old Jorge Gonzalez. Deputies believe he may have been in a fight with at least 3 other people the night before he was found, but the exact circumstances that led to the incident are still under investigation. At this point, they still don't know if the person that they were originally there to arrest had anything to do with Gonzalez's death. Detectives are still piecing everything together. The next one is also from this past January. A woman from Knoxville, Tennessee named Shaylee Smith was staying at a Days Inn in Cullman, Alabama for her sister's volleyball tournament when she noticed something weird in the bathroom. She was getting undressed and happened to look up at the vent where she saw a screw that didn't seem like it belonged there. When she pulled at it, it turned out to be a hidden camera tucked up in the vent. She'd already been there for a whole night before she spotted it. Shaylee immediately told her mom, who then called the Cullman Police Department. Officers came to the room, seized the camera as evidence, and began investigating. Police said that the camera didn't have an SD card in it when Shaylee found it, so it wasn't clear how long it had been there or if it had recorded anything. Shaylee checked into a different hotel for the rest of the weekend, but said the whole experience had her shaken up. She'd double and triple check every room and said she had trouble sleeping after. Hotel management from that Days Inn location told the news that they were actively cooperating with police but couldn't comment further, seeing as it is an ongoing investigation. In October 2021, police in Yangpyeong, South Korea arrested 4 people after discovering they'd installed hidden cameras throughout the rooms of an entire motel, and then tried to use the footage to blackmail the guests. According to police, the suspects filmed people staying in the motel for months and even tried to extort money from some of the hundreds of guests whose images were captured. Police didn't release a ton of detail about exactly how the cameras were hidden, but supposedly the group bribed a motel employee to place tiny cameras on the monitors or computers in each room while he was cleaning them. This wasn't an isolated problem in South Korea. Authorities have said thousands of hidden camera crimes have been investigated over recent years, including cameras placed in bathrooms, bedrooms, and other spaces where people are expecting privacy. In July 1995, 21-year-old Yolanda Penick checked into the Capri Motel in Portland with her young son. By the next morning, staff noticed the room was in complete disarray. The beds had been stripped, towels were gone, and it was very obvious that a serious struggle had taken place. Staff called the police. Yolanda's car was found abandoned nearby a Greyhound bus station. Luckily, her son was inside and he was unharmed, but no sign of Yolanda. Authorities set their sights on her common-law husband, Abdur Rashid Al-Wadud, who had a history of threatening Yolanda. Prosecutors said he confronted her at the hotel. Yolanda's remains were never found. Al-Wadud was arrested though, tried, and in March of 1996 was sentenced to life in prison. In late 2021, police in Virginia and DC were hunting for a guy named Anthony Eugene Robinson after several women vanished after meeting up with him. Cops have connected him to at least 2 confirmed deaths and possibly more, all women he'd met through dating apps. According to investigators, Robinson's playbook was to connect with women online, set up meetings at cheap hotels or motels, and then, well, the woman would never make it home. In the 2 cases authorities have directly connected to him, both women were caught on camera walking into a hotel room with Robinson. Security footage showed him leaving later, pushing a shopping cart that appeared to contain the victims' bodies. Those 2 women, Ellen Beth Redman and Tanita Laurie Smith, were discovered in an open area near a motel days after they'd gone missing. Police think Robinson might be responsible for other victims as well, whose bodies turned up near motels or in wooded spots with a shopping cart left nearby. Robinson was arrested in November of 2021, and investigators from multiple jurisdictions have used his phone records and video evidence to connect him to several of the cases. In March 2025, housekeeping at a motel in Michigan walked into a scene they would have never expected. They were cleaning a room after a guest checked out when a 3-foot alligator popped out from under the bed. It was just hanging out next to a vent. One of them called 911, of course, and waited with the reptile until help arrived. People who talked about the incident later said the alligator didn't chase anybody or lash out. It did let out some warning hisses, though. Police and animal control traced the alligator back to the guest who stayed there the night before. That person had been in town doing exotic animal presentations at local elementary schools and was traveling with several animals, including this gator named Wally. Somehow, he'd just forgotten him in the room. The owner drove back from Detroit and picked him up later that evening. In July 2019, police in Austin, Texas were looking for a woman named San Juana Macias, who'd gone missing after being seen on July 5th. A relative of a man she'd been dating, 40-year-old Jamie Wingwood, called police worried something bad had happened to her, so officers started tracking them. Eventually, deputies ended up chasing Wingwood's car into Louisiana, where he was arrested after a long pursuit. While investigators were talking to Wingwood, he ended up telling them to look under the mattress in room 219 at the Roadway Inn in Austin. Police and Texas Rangers had already searched that room. Motel staff had also cleaned it, but they hadn't found anything. Sure enough, though, when they went back, officers lifted the mattress and box spring, and they found Macias's body hidden inside the bed frame, tucked into the void under the mattress. In April 2015, two brothers were walking through a forest in North Wales when they noticed something strange sticking out of the ground near a forest track. At first they thought it was an animal bone. When they looked closer though, they realized it was actually a human skull, partially buried in the soil. They called police and the area was immediately sealed off. As officers searched the surrounding forest, they found almost an entire human skeleton scattered nearby. The remains belonged to an adult male, believed to be between 35 and 65 years old. Forensics found that the body had likely been in the forest for at least a decade, possibly even longer, but they had no idea who he was. Investigators also found no obvious signs of trauma on the bones, so they couldn't determine how he died either. To this day, the man has never been identified. In October 1991, a 62-year-old man named Colin Oliver was walking home along a quiet lane near the village of Bolney in West Sussex, England, when he stopped to take a break off the side of the road. As he stepped into the nearby woods to relieve himself, he saw something that he would never forget. Torso wrapped up in a piece of carpet hidden in the undergrowth. That is the last thing you ever want to see when taking a leak. Anyway, he walked straight to the police station, reported it. When officers investigated the scene, they confirmed what he'd seen: a human torso, no head, no hands. One arm was cut above the elbow, the other below it. Police thought the limbs might have been taken off to hide tattoos or anything else that would make it easier for the remains to be identified. Months later, the remains were buried at a cemetery under the name Unknown Male, but that wasn't the end of the story. Decades later, in 2009, police exhumed the body and used newer forensic science to learn more. They now believe the victim was a well-built man between about 30 and 45 who'd likely spent at least some of the last year of his life in the UK or near the France-Germany border. Despite all that, no one's ever been identified or charged in connection with his death. His head and hands have never been found, and what exactly happened to this man before he was dumped in those woods and why remains a mystery more than 30 years later. In January 1924, three experienced fur trappers, Edward Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris, headed into the snowy woods of Deschutes National Forest in Oregon to spend the winter trapping animals for their pelts. They'd rented a remote log cabin near Little Lava Lake to live and work through the season. The last time anyone saw them alive was January 15th, when a fellow outdoorsman snowshoed over, stayed the night, and then left the next morning. He later told police the three were in good spirits the night before. After that, nobody heard from them again. Weeks went by with no word back in town. By April 1924, people got worried enough to mount a search. What they found at the cabin was eerie. Burnt food left on the stove, a table set for a meal, coats and firearms had been left behind. Out near Little Lava Lake, searchers noticed a patch of disturbed ice. When the thaw opened it up, the bodies of all three men bobbed up from under the surface. Each had been violently attacked and their bodies weighed down beneath the frozen water for months. As for who was responsible, sheriffs investigated, but no suspect was ever arrested or convicted. The case is still a total mystery. In April 2012, on a popular hiking route in Provo Canyon, Utah, something disturbing was hiding just a few hundred yards off the trail. A U.S. Forest Service law enforcement officer named James Shelfler was doing a routine foot patrol when he noticed a thin tripwire stretched across a path near a crude shelter built by hikers. When Shelfler followed the line of the wire, he found a booby trap straight out of Predator. One device was made with rope and fishing line connected to a 20-pound rock with sharpened sticks attached to it. Someone stepped on the tripwire, would swing down at roughly head or chest level. A second tripwire nearby was set so that a person walking in would fall forward onto a cluster of sharpened wooden stakes planted in the ground. Both traps were right at the entrance points of the shelter, the spot hapless hikers could easily have walked through. Luckily, Shelfler got here first. Being trained in recognizing dangerous devices from his military experience, he disarmed both traps before anyone was hurt. Police later tracked down two men, 19-year-old Benjamin Stephen Rotowski and 21-year-old Kai Matthew Christensen. They were arrested on suspicion of reckless endangerment. Men told police they set the traps to catch wildlife, like wild boars or rabbits, but police didn't buy the explanation. Plus, even if they were trying to hunt animals, someone could have easily died. The traps were so close to a busy trailhead, just about a mile from where people start their hikes, so these guys were either malicious psychos or, at best, just total idiots. This next story comes from a now deleted Reddit user and goes as follows. I was hiking a rarely used trail in northern Ontario last spring. I go out a lot alone, mostly to hike and get away from the city. I noticed something off about the smell before I saw it. First I thought it was a dead deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a partially skinned coyote pinned to a tree with wire. Someone had stretched it out, legs tied back, and left it hanging at eye level. Next to it were smaller bones scattered in a circle, ribs, paw bones, a skull that didn't match the coyote. I didn't linger. I backtracked to the main trail and have not been back since. In April 1978, a man and his brother were mushrooming in bushland beside Swamp Road near the town of Truro, South Australia, and they thought they saw a cow bone. When they looked closer, they realized it was attached to a shoe, and inside the shoe was human skin and painted toenails. Police were called, and what followed was one of the most chilling series of discoveries in Australian bushland. Over the next year, police searched the area and found the skeletal remains of multiple women and girls. These remains belonged to several missing women who'd vanished from Adelaide in late 1976 and early 1977. Some of the remains were just bones scattered among clothing and personal items, far from any road or town, and they all led back to a man later identified as Christopher Robin Worrell and his accomplice James Miller, who both had a very strange and complicated relationship. The two had met in prison and eventually began cruising around picking up women before ending their lives. James Miller apparently never actually touched any of the women himself, but he ended up being convicted and doing the time because Christopher Worrell died in a car crash before either of the men were ever caught. In August 1947, two potholers exploring a cave in North Yorkshire, England, discovered something laying under a pile of stones deep inside a narrow passage. After squeezing through a low entrance, they saw a pair of shoes and a human skeleton lying under a large rock. The bones were old, but some of the man's belongings were still there. There was a suit, a hat, matches, and some toiletries. Police couldn't figure out who the man was or how he ended up in the cave, but there was a bottle of sodium cyanide, a poisonous chemical, which meant the man may have taken his own life. Nobody reported a missing person that matched him, though, and over 70 years later, the identity of the skeleton is still a mystery. In 1974, a group calling themselves the North American Wildlife Research Team built something bizarre deep in the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest in southern Oregon. They weren't hunting deer or mountain lions, they were trying to catch a Bigfoot. Using wood planks and heavy metal bands, they constructed what looked like a giant animal trap, about 10 feet long and 4 feet tall, anchored down with telephone poles and baited with carcasses. The idea was that if something big enough wandered in, the doors would drop and it would be caught inside. For 6 years, the trap sat out there, hundreds of yards from any road. They maintained it, checked it regularly, baited it with animal carcasses, but they never caught a Sasquatch. They did catch a couple bears, though. By the early 80s, the project was abandoned, but the trap sat there for decades. It was eventually moved to a hiking trail as this weird roadside attraction where it still sits today. In August 2024, a family in Jefferson County, Alabama started noticing their German Shepherd mix was bringing home human bones. The first time it happened, the dog came back from the nearby woods carrying what looked like a human skull. Tests later confirmed it belonged to an unidentified person. There was a bullet wound on the bone. Over the next several months, the dog returned with more pieces, parts of a leg, a jawbone, all of them dragged out of the surrounding woods. Police ran forensic tests, confirming all the bones came from the same person. They decided to put a tracking device on the dog to try and find where the remains were coming from, but it never located a source. As of the latest updates, investigators still haven't identified the victim or figured out where the bones came from. And finally, this Reddit user came across a mysterious list in the woods. This was last summer, they write. I was hiking alone on public land, went off trail to follow a creek. About 10 minutes in, I saw a piece of printer paper nailed to a tree at around shoulder height. It had been laminated. It was a list, about 20 lines long, with stuff like blue jacket, red backpack, dog, medium size, hiking poles, solo, couple, truck, white. Some items were crossed out, some weren't. Next to a few of them were dates written in pen. Recent dates within the last couple weeks. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to figure out what it could be for. There was also fresh nail holes below the paper, like older sheets had been put there and removed. I didn't take a photo, I wish I had, but at the time, it felt like a bad idea to pull my phone out and stand there any longer. I took a different way back and stayed on trail after that. Went back with a friend a week later. The paper was gone. Back in 1986, the Chernobyl meltdown blasted the nearby pine forest with so much radiation that the needles turned bright red and the trees died off in days. And that's where the name comes from, the Red Forest. This 10 square kilometer stretch, part of the bigger exclusion zone straddling Ukraine and Belarus, still holds onto those dead trees and leaves pretty much intact even after 40 years. Normal decay happens because microbes and fungi break down organic matter, but radiation levels here wiped out most of those decomposers or messed with their DNA so bad it just can't function right. Walk through it today and you'll see piles of 1986 needles that look fresh just sitting there on the ground. The real problem hits during dry summers when wildfires spark up, and they do pretty regularly. In 2020 alone, fires burned over 8,600 hectares in the zone, kicking up plumes of smoke loaded with leftover radioactive particles, which then traveled hundreds of kilometers and dropped back down with rain, spreading contamination to places like Kiev and other parts of Europe. Monitoring stations picked up spikes as far as Sweden during those fires. From 1949 to 1989, the Soviet Union used a stretch of Kazakhstan as its primary nuclear testing ground, the Semipalatinsk test site. Locals called it the Polygon. Over those 40 years, 456 nuclear weapons were detonated there. Some underground, many atmospheric, especially early on. The uncomfortable part is that villages were sitting right in the fallout paths. More than 1 million people lived in the surrounding area during those decades, and for years nobody evacuated them, even though fallout was drifting across farms. Animals grazed on contaminated grass, kids were outside during detonations that shook windows miles away. By the late 80s, Kazakh researchers were publishing data showing elevated cancer rates, especially thyroid cancer and leukemia. Reports also documented higher rates of birth defects compared to non-exposed areas. The site covers around 18,500 square kilometers. Some areas still test positive for plutonium contamination today. Kazakhstan officially shut it down in 1991. In October 1952, Britain wanted to know what would happen if a nuclear bomb went off inside a ship in a harbor, so they staged it. They anchored an old ship, HMS Plym, off the Montbello Islands in Western Australia, placed a 25 kiloton plutonium device inside the hull, and detonated it. The ship didn't survive in any recognizable form. Steel was vaporized, other sections twisted and fused into these strange glassy fragments that scattered across the seabed and nearby islands. Divers later documented debris fields in the lagoon. Cleanup operations in the 90s removed larger pieces, but not everything. There's still plutonium contamination. Access to parts of the islands are restricted. Visitors are warned not to pick up metal fragments that they might find. How long will it take to go away? Well, plutonium-239 has a half-life of about 24,000 years, so whatever is still there, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. In the 50s and early 60s, Britain carried out 7 major nuclear tests at Maralinga in South Australia, along with hundreds of smaller trials. But one of the most disturbing events actually happened earlier in 1953 during the Operation Totem tests. That was a 9 kiloton detonation. The fallout plume didn't behave the way planners expected though. It drifted straight over Aboriginal communities. People later described a strange black mist rolling in after the blast. It burned their eyes, made them vomit, skin blistered. A man named Yemi Lester, who was a child at the time, said he went blind after being caught in that fallout. He spent decades campaigning for recognition of what happened. A royal commission in 1985 found that safety procedures were very flawed, and that the indigenous people living nearby were not properly warned or protected. Some families unknowingly camped in contaminated craters afterward. Animals were hunted and eaten from areas where stuff had settled into the soil. Cleanup didn't begin seriously until the 90s. Contaminated soil was scraped up and buried, but plutonium particles were scattered across wide areas. Even today, some zones are still restricted. During World War II, Britain wanted to test biological weapons, so between 1942 and 1943, they chose a small island off the coast of Scotland called Grunard. They tethered sheep to stakes and detonated explosives packed with anthrax spores. The test proved the weapon worked. The problem was the spores stayed. Anthrax can survive in soil for decades under the right conditions. After the test, the island was declared off limits. In 1981, activists from a group calling themselves the Dark Harvest Commandos secretly landed there. They collected soil samples and sent them to labs. The spores were still viable nearly 40 years later. That stunt forced the government to finally take action, and from 1983 to 1986, crews soaked the topsoil in a formaldehyde solution and removed the heavily contaminated layers. Afterwards, sheep were reintroduced as a test, and these ones survived, so the island was officially declared safe in 1990. Safe. In the middle of what used to be the Aral Sea sat Velzhorozdenia Island. During the Cold War, it housed the Soviet Union's Aralsk-7 bioweapons facility. From the 50s until 1992, they tested pathogens like anthrax, plague, and tularemia there. They tested nasty stuff, weaponized anthrax, plague, and smallpox, chaining monkeys and other animals to stakes for open-air explosions to see how everything would spread in the wind. Labs churned out tons of the bacteria, grown in huge vats. When the USSR collapsed, the whole operation got abandoned and left behind. Burial pits ended up being filled with stainless steel drums of live spores just shoved into the ground without proper sealing. Meanwhile, the Aral Sea was shrinking because rivers feeding it had been diverted for irrigation, and by the early 2000s, the island wasn't really an island anymore. It became connected to the mainland by dry seabed, and now there was this fear that rodents would start to move in and potentially carry pathogens out, spreading them to the mainland. US inspection teams in the 90s cracked open pits and found anthrax still kicking after decades underground. Journalists who snuck in also described lab rooms with shattered glass vials and half-buried plague-infected sheep skeletons poking out from the sand. A 2002 cleanup effort bleached over 300 hectares and poured concrete on some of the most contaminated spots. From 1952 to 1989, Rocky Flats near Denver produced the plutonium cores for US nuclear weapons. These were the triggers inside hydrogen bombs. Rocky Flats was one of the most secretive facilities in the country. But in 1989, the FBI raided it. Helicopters circled overhead while agents carried out search warrants. Investigators were looking into illegal waste handling. Allegations included the burning of plutonium-contaminated materials in an incinerator and the improper storage of radioactive waste. Over the years, the site had experienced fires and accidental releases. Contamination had spread beyond the boundaries of the plant in the past, including a major plutonium fire in 1957. Cleanup ultimately cost billions of dollars. By 1996, the plant was shut down permanently, and crews tore down all the 385 buildings. People living in Westminster and Broomfield noticed clusters of leukemia back in the 80s and 90s. And state health records link at least 10 extra cases a year to dust drifting from the site. Every now and then, the wind kicks up tiny traces from spots that never fully got cleaned. The Hanford site in Washington state produced plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb and later supplied material for much of the US nuclear arsenal. Left behind 177 underground tanks holding roughly 56 million gallons of radioactive and chemical waste. Over time, more than 60 have been confirmed to have leaked waste into the ground. Beyond leaks, workers have reported exposure to chemical vapors rising from the tanks. Since the 2010s, dozens of workers have reported symptoms like nosebleeds, breathing issues, and skin irritation. The Department of Energy has acknowledged vapor releases in more recent years, but for a long time, the problem was downplayed, if not just outright ignored. Cleanup at Hanford is one of the most expensive environmental efforts in US history, costing billions of dollars a year. From 1948 to 1958, the US ran 43 nuclear tests around Eniwetok Atoll, blasting islands apart and leaving behind huge piles of radioactive dirt, debris, and bomb parts. In 1979, crews dumped all that mess into a giant crater on Runnet Island, poured a concrete dome over it. There was no waterproof liner underneath, it was just gravel, so it was basically radioactive sludge sealed under concrete. Problem is, Rising seas have been splashing over the dome every year, slowly cracking it, bringing all that plutonium into the lagoon. Tests found levels that are far too high for drinking water. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres visited in 2019 and called it a coffin, one that's unfortunately leaking. People on nearby islands are also getting extra radiation doses from the leftover fallout. Crabs in the lagoon are so contaminated that people avoid eating them. The Department of Energy admits they never built the dome to handle rising sea levels. Not far from Chernobyl's reactor 4, there's a place called Rosoka. After the 1986 explosion, hundreds of vehicles used in the immediate response were brought here. Fire trucks that drove in the initial blaze, helicopters that dropped sand and boron over the reactor, armored vehicles that pushed radioactive debris off rooftops. Once they were too contaminated to safely use, they were stripped of salvageable parts and left in rows. Some were later buried in trenches to reduce surface radiation. Throughout the 90s, though, scavengers slipped past patrols. They would torch tires for rubber and haul frames to scrap yards outside the zone. Some of that metal wound up melted into rebar for Kiev apartments and factories. Thankfully, tighter fences and cameras went up in the 2010s. Today, much of the heavy equipment has been dismantled or reburied, but parts of the graveyard still exist in more controlled areas. Excavating it all would kick up a dust cloud of radioactive particles, though, so it mostly just stays sunk where it is, slowly rusting under trees. Out in a quiet field in northern Siberia, archaeologists uncovered a massive grave that's completely unsettling. Inside was a pit with 77 skeletons, dating back to about 2,800 years ago. The way these people died, well, let's just say it wasn't pretty. Most of the victims were women and very young people. Looking at the bones, scientists could see blunt force trauma to the skulls, which tells you right away this was deliberate violence. Whoever did this was methodical. Even stranger is how they were buried. The bodies weren't just tossed into the ground. They were buried with bronze jewelry, pottery, burned seeds, and the bones of nearly 100 animals, including a whole young cow under some of the humans. It almost looks like some kind of ritual. Researchers think this might have been part of land grabs or tribal conflicts during Europe's early Iron Age, wiping out entire families to weaken a rival group. Bouvet Island is one of the loneliest chunks of land on the planet, an ice-covered volcanic speck in the South Atlantic Ocean, closer to Antarctica than anywhere else. Getting there by boat is a nightmare, and the weather is brutal most of the time. But in April of 1964, a British survey team from the Royal Navy's HMS Protector finally touched down on this frozen rock. They were there to check out some newly formed volcanic terrain, but what they ended up finding was something way more weird: a lifeboat sitting in a small lagoon. It was unmarked with no motor and no sails, and around it were a few oars, a barrel, a flattened tank, but zero signs of anyone who might have used it. There were no footprints, no campsite, no bodies. There was nothing to explain how it got there, and to make things stranger, when another team returned a couple years later, the boat was gone. It had vanished without a trace. News of this came out just this month. Archaeologists in the Czech Republic discovered hundreds of 5,000-year-old burial mounds hiding under farmland. Long, narrow mounds called long barrows, built by Neolithic farmers around 3000 BCE. Over thousands of years of plowing, most of them had basically flattened out, so you'd never know they were there just by looking at the fields. The team used aerial photos, laser scanning, and what's called magnetometry. Magnetometry is basically a way to measure tiny variations in Earth's magnetic field, which can sometimes reveal stuff buried underground. With these tools, they mapped all kinds of stuff, including graves and ritual sites that have been sitting under there for who knows how long. And the mounds sit along the edges of old settlements, which means these people were purposely keeping where they lived separate from where they buried their dead, even 5,000 years ago. In 2001, researchers digging at a site on a remote island off the coast of northern Scotland came across what looked like two Bronze Age burials. They found a male and a female skeleton lying in a fetal position. At first, it seemed like a normal archaeological find, but the first red flag appeared when they noticed the skeletons didn't fit the timeline of the site. They'd been dead for centuries before they were actually buried in the ground. But the real strange part came 10 years later during DNA testing. Scientists realized that these were not two individuals. They were composite jigsaw people, kind of Frankenstein creations. What they thought was the female skeleton was actually a collage of a male skull, a female torso, and an arm from some other unknown person. And the male was made up of body parts from at least 3 different men. They hadn't been just thrown together though. The parts were carefully selected so that the joints fit perfectly, making them look like a single person to the naked eye. After these people died, their bodies were placed in a peat bog for about a year. The high acidity and low oxygen in the bog preserved the soft tissue and tanned the skin, basically mummifying them. And for reasons we can only guess, the living then pulled these bodies out of the swamp, disassembled them, and then combined them into the pair that was later found buried in the dirt. It's very weird. High up in the death zone of Mount Everest, the atmosphere is so thin, the human body literally begins to die, cell by cell. And in this isolated wasteland, there's a famous and grim waypoint known as Green Boots. Since 1996, climbers heading for the summit have had to step over or around the frozen body of a man curled in a limestone cave. He's wearing a bright red jacket and neon green climbing boots. The body is widely believed to be Sawang Palajor, an Indian climber who got trapped in a massive blizzard. Because the air at that altitude is too thin for helicopters and too dangerous for human recovery teams to carry extra weight, he was just left where he fell. And over time, the cave became a mandatory landmark for everyone on the North Ridge. Climbers would use his neon boots to measure how much further they had to go to reach the top. For over 40 years, a family of 6 lived in a hand-built log cabin in a corner of the Siberian wilderness so remote that the nearest town was 150 miles away. The Lykovs were old believers who fled into the forest in 1936 to escape religious persecution. They stayed there completely cut off from the rest of humanity until a group of geologists spotted their garden from a helicopter in 1978. When the geologists finally hiked to the spot, they found a family that kind of looked like they were living in the Middle Ages. They were wearing clothes made of hemp cloth and surviving on a diet of potato patties mixed with ground rye and hemp seeds. It was nuts because they had no idea what was happening on the outside, of course. They had no idea World War II happened. They didn't know humans had landed on the moon. They were in their own little bubble. But the isolation that kept them safe also made them vulnerable when they were found. Within a few years of meeting the geologists, 3 of the family members died. Their immune systems had no defense against the modern germs the researchers brought with them. Only one daughter, Agafia, remains. She still lives in that same isolated spot, refusing to leave the only home she's ever known, surrounded by the graves of her family. In the mid-1800s, Sir John Franklin set off to find the Northwest Passage with 2 ships and 129 men. They vanished. Years later, search parties found a few graves on Beechey Island, a desolate rock in the Canadian Arctic. In the 80s, an anthropologist named Owen Beatty decided to exhume the bodies to find out what went wrong. Because the ground is permanent permafrost, essentially a natural deep freezer, the bodies were almost perfectly preserved. So when they opened the coffin of a 20-year-old named John Torrington, the team was met with a pretty terrifying sight. Torrington was staring back at them. His skin was still there, but it had turned a ghostly bluish gray. His eyes were wide open. But probably the most disturbing part was what the scientists found inside him. Torrington's hair contained a massive amount of lead. Turns out the tins of canned food they'd been eating had been sealed with lead solder. As the men sat trapped in the ice for years, lead leached into their food. They weren't just freezing and starving, they were actually slowly going insane and dying from heavy metal poisoning. Dura Europos was a Roman town in the Syrian desert that was wiped off the map during a siege by Persians in the year 256. When archaeologists started digging there in the 1930s, they found a narrow tunnel underground, and inside it were the bodies of 19 Roman soldiers and 1 Persian. They're all piled together in a heap. Now, at first, researchers thought the tunnel had collapsed on them, but the way the bodies were stacked didn't really match a cave-in. What actually happened was much darker. During the siege, the Persians were digging a tunnel under the city wall to bring it down. The Romans realized what they were doing and started digging their own tunnel to intercept them. When the Persians heard the Romans getting close, they set a trap. They lit a fire using sulfur and tar, 2 materials that produce this thick, toxic smoke. Then they used simple air pumps to push that smoke down the tunnel toward the Romans. When the Roman soldiers rushed forward in the darkness, they would have ran straight into a cloud of poison gas. And within minutes, they were choking and collapsing in a tight space, unable to escape. The Persian soldier found with them was probably the one who stayed behind to keep the fire going. Today, the scene is believed to be one of the earliest known examples of chemical warfare. And this one's really cool. Archaeologists may have found the baddest man to ever live. While working at a 6th century cemetery in northern Italy, he found the remains of a man who belonged to a Germanic tribe called the Longobards. While the other skeletons in the cemetery were buried with standard grave goods, this man was different. His right arm had been amputated at the mid-forearm. Amputations back then were almost always a death sentence. There was such a high chance of infection, and that's if you even made it past the loss of BLOOD. But this man survived for years, and he replaced his limb, not with a wooden stump, but an iron blade. The end of his arm bone showed signs of remodeling, meaning he used the blade for a long time. There were traces of what was likely leather, which he would have used to strap the blade to his stump, and the enamel on the right side of his jaw was worn down to basically nothing. He had a massive infection in his gums. And that tells us he was using his teeth to pull the leather straps tight. He lived in a brutal warrior culture, and rather than retiring after losing his limb, he just turned himself into a living weapon. Deep inside a cave system in the Atapuerca Mountains of Spain lies a chamber whose name translates to the Pit of Bones. To get there, you have to crawl through a nearly half-mile of narrow passages and then descend a 43-foot vertical shaft. At the bottom of this pit, researchers found a massive collection of ancient human remains, at least 28 people belonging to an early human ancestor. They lived about 430,000 years ago, long before modern humans even existed. The most disturbing discovery in the pit is a specimen known as Skull 17. It belongs to a young adult who was otherwise healthy. However, the skull has two very distinct, nearly identical holes just above the left eye. Researchers used modern forensic imaging to analyze the fractures and figured out they couldn't have been caused by a fall down the shaft. Both holes were made by the same object, hitting the skull from two different angles. It would have been a lethal attack. This makes Skull 17 the victim of the oldest cold case in history. 500,000 years ago, in the pitch black of a remote cave, one of our ancestors killed someone and then dumped the body down a hole to hide the evidence. During a deep-sea expedition off the coast of California in July 2016, scientists exploring the ocean floor spotted this really cool-looking purple orb thingy. Looks like one of the devil fruits in One Piece. The discovery happened during a mission aboard the research vessel EV Nautilus, which was exploring an underwater canyon near the Channel Islands. A remotely operated vehicle was crawling along the seafloor about 5,300 feet below the surface when the cameras picked up the strange thing near a rocky ledge. The researchers watching the live video feed were immediately confused, saying, "What is that?" Another responding, "I'm stumped. I have no idea." And the cherry on top of this was that a crab was also hanging out nearby. It seemed interested in the object too, and at one point its leg bumped into the thing.
I'm being an all-out battle here right now.
Alright, just zoom in again.
Oh, no.
Come on,
I'm
buddy.
almost never referring
What
to
if
a
it's an
crab.
egg sac of some sort?
It could be.
I love that one guy who's like, "Come on, buddy." Just a funny thing to say to a crab. Anyway, they decided to use the submersible's suction device to pull the strange object into a container before the crab could grab it. When it was brought back to the ship, it did something unexpected. The purple ball started to open up, and suddenly the team could see little body parts sticking out, like a tiny foot and some feeler-like things. That's when they realized it was actually a sea slug. The scientists thought it might have been a species no one had seen before, though, so they sent samples to the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology to take a closer look. During a deep-sea expedition off the coast of Australia in 2017, scientists hauled up a fish that immediately confused everyone on board. At first glance, it didn't look like it had a face. The discovery happened during a research voyage exploring the abyss east of Australia, where scientists were sampling marine life living roughly 4,000 meters or about 13,000 feet below the surface. Down there, sunlight never reaches the water, and the temperature sits just above freezing. Researchers examined the fish. Something about it looked completely wrong. The front of its head appeared smooth, featureless. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, at least not that anyone could see. The mouth actually sits underneath. But because of that strange appearance, the animal quickly picked up the nickname the Faceless Fish. First, the team wondered if they discovered an entirely new species, but they soon realized the fish had actually been documented before. It turned out to be Typhlonus nasus, a rare species of cusk eel. The species was first discovered during the famous HMS Challenger expedition in 1874. But sightings since then have been extremely rare. Scientists believe the fish's eyes are actually hidden beneath its skin. In the deep ocean, vision isn't very useful anyway. At those depths, the environment is permanently dark, so a lot of animals rely on other senses than sight. This story comes from a Reddit user named Brutus Black, who described a strange sighting while working on a pearl boat in the Arafura Sea, which sits between northern Australia and the island of New Guinea. He explained he spent about 18 months working on the vessel. Part of his job involved standing watch in the wheelhouse. The task was fairly simple. The boat followed a route on the navigation system, and the person on watch had to make sure it stayed on course. If it drifted, they'd manually steer it back onto the path. His shift ran from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. Well, one morning around 7, he noticed something unusual off the port side of the boat. Sitting out in the water in the distance was what looked like a bright white cube. Judging distance at sea is difficult without landmarks, but he estimated it was roughly 200 meters away. Strangely, the object wasn't appearing on the boat's radar or navigation system, which normally shows other vessels in the area. It also wasn't moving with the waves the way floating objects usually do. So he grabbed a pair of binoculars to get a better look. Through the lenses, he could clearly see that the object had sharp edges and a square shape, confirming it really did look like a cube. Based on how large it appeared through the binoculars, he guessed it might have been about the size of a van. Later, the crewmate coming on shift brought him a coffee and saw the object as well, so he wasn't imagining it. Years afterward, when videos of the Pentagon's Tic Tac UFO sightings were released, the descriptions reminded the Reddit user of that strange white cube. In August 2023, scientists exploring the deepest part of the Baltic Sea came across something they really didn't expect to see. Their instruments started picking up huge plumes of gas rising from the bottom of the ocean. The leak was coming from a place called Landsort Deep, which is the lowest point in the entire Baltic Sea, about 400 meters or 1,300 feet below the surface. When researchers scanned the area with sonar, they realized this wasn't just a small vent. The methane was bubbling out across an area about 20 square kilometers. What was really odd too was how the gas behaved once it left the sea floor. Normally, methane released deep in the ocean dissolves into the surrounding water long before it gets very far, but here, the bubbles were rising almost the entire way to the surface. Researchers expect methane bubbles to travel maybe 50 meters upward before disappearing. Instead, the plumes were climbing around 380 meters, stopping just a few dozen feet short of the surface. That shouldn't really happen at that depth. One theory is that the Baltic Sea has an unusually thin layer of methane-eating microbes. Normally, these bacteria act like a natural filter, consuming up to 90% of methane before it escapes, but here, the layer is only a few centimeters thick, meaning far more gas may be slipping through. Exactly what's causing the leak? That's still unclear. Off the coast of Long Branch, New Jersey, about 5 miles out and 90 feet underwater, there's something you definitely don't expect to see on the ocean floor: 2 full-size steam locomotives from the 1850s, sitting upright side by side. You can still make out the wheels and boilers through the rust and marine growth, which is pretty cool considering they've been down there for over 160 years. The first clue of the engines came in 1985 when diver Paul Hepler was surveying the seafloor with a magnetometer. He kept getting massive metal readings. When he went down to check, he realized what he'd been picking up were 19th century locomotives. As for how they got down there, no one knows. There are no records of them being shipped, lost at sea, or involved in any accident, and there's no nearby wreckage. One theory is that they were being transported by boat along the east coast and somehow ended up overboard, maybe during a storm, but honestly, that's just speculation. This next story comes from a Reddit user named Do Exercise 2751, who wrote, "Submariner here. I was a sonar technician, and we were out on a mission and had the towed sonar arrays out. We were deep, and it picked up on a couple of bios, like shrimp and whales. It was quiet for about 20 minutes after we passed them, and all of a sudden, we heard a screeching noise that sounded like metal on metal. We thought we'd run into another submarine. The whole boat went into battle stations, aka each crew member went where they were assigned to be in the case of an emergency, and we woke up our SME, subject matter expert writers, to determine what the F that sound was. Went on for about 5 minutes. just in and out. It sounded like a song if you started to replay it. The whole thing was recorded, but the acting SME couldn't determine what it was, nor could the sonar chief. A message was sent out when we went to periscope depth, and the recording was sent to our squadron and the Office of Naval Intelligence once we pulled in. I do not know what happened afterward, but apparently the Navy collects these types of recordings regularly. From what we can tell, whatever caused that sound was close and almost as big as the boat. I couldn't tell if it was bio, like an animal, or another boat. There were no screw noises, we didn't take on any water, and we surely didn't hit anything. To this day, I still don't know what it was. Everyone was sure it was a bio, most likely animal we never discovered. At the time of this occurrence, only military submarines were capable of going that deep, so individually, we ruled it out as anything mechanical. Look at this incredible footage. What is this place? Is it some kind of lost ancient city now submerged underwater? Well, unfortunately not, but the story behind it is still really cool. What you're looking at here is the Neptune Memorial Reef, known as the world's first underwater cemetery. It sits off the coast of Florida. Instead of just scattering ashes in the water though, families can have them mixed into the concrete structures that make up the reef, which are sculpted into these beautiful columns and statues. Over time, these memorials then become homes for coral and fish, so they end up contributing to the ecosystem. It was built in the 2000s by the Ocean Research and Conservation Association. It's been growing ever since as corals colonize the sculptures and fish make their home in the nooks and crannies. In 2024, researchers discovered something completely unexpected deep in the Pacific Ocean. Oxygen being produced without sunlight way down on the ocean floor. Kinda crazy, because everyone learns that oxygen comes from plants and algae using sunlight. So hearing that it can come from the deep sea and pitch black, it's kinda hard to wrap your head around. Scientists were studying mineral-rich rocks called the polymetallic nodules, scattered across the seafloor in an area known as the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. These nodules contain metals like manganese, copper, nickel, and cobalt, the same stuff people want to mine for batteries. Researchers analyzed samples. They found that the nodules were actually producing oxygen in total darkness. In lab experiments, the minerals seemed to behave almost like tiny natural batteries, splitting water into oxygen and hydrogen, again with no help from sunlight. So scientists dubbed this dark oxygen. If this is happening in the ocean here on Earth, could be happening in other places too. And by that I mean other planets, even ones possibly with no light at all.
First entry takes us to the desolate wilderness of the San Bois Mountains in Oklahoma, a remote corner often frequented by hunters and hikers. On October 8, 2009, Bobby, Sherilyn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison vanished without a trace, seemingly swallowed whole by the Oweechee National Forest. They were scouting a property for sale, a seemingly innocuous trip that turned into a waking nightmare. Their truck was found abandoned days later, locked with their dog starving inside, their wallets, phones, and even Madison's purse was still in the vehicle. A chilling discovery inside the truck was a satanic Bible and a note hinting at a dispute. For 4 long years, the forest held its breath, offering no answers. Then in November 2013, 3 skeletons were found by hunters, just 3 miles from where the truck was abandoned. The remains were later identified as the Jamison family. The cause of death? Undetermined. No signs of trauma, no clear motive, just a haunting mystery forever etched into the landscape of the Oweechee. What happened to the Jamisons in those isolated woods? The silence of the forest offers no comfort. The Grand Canyon is a place of immense scale, but in 2011 a hiker found something that reduced that scale to a terrifyingly personal level. While trekking near the south rim, a visitor spotted a human hand resting on a rock ledge, completely detached from any body. This wasn't a historical artifact or a medical specimen, it was a fresh discovery. National Park Service investigators were absolutely baffled by this. Despite a massive search involving cadaver dogs and rappelling teams, no other remains were ever found. No torso, no skull, no identification. The hand was eventually linked through DNA to a man that had been reported missing months earlier, but how his hand ended up alone on a ledge miles from where he was last seen and with no signs of a struggle or a fall remains one of the canyon's most gruesome puzzles. Yosemite National Park, a symbol of American wilderness, usually evokes images of grandeur and awe, but in October 2016, a chilling discovery shattered that idyllic image. A human foot, still encased encased in a hiking boot, found by a park visitor near a popular trail. The foot was found off-trail in a remote and kind of steep area, but investigators confirmed that it was human and believed to have been there for some time, possibly months or even years. Despite extensive searches, no other remains were ever located, and the identity of the individual remained a mystery. How did a single foot, still in its boot, end up in such an isolated location? Was it an accident, a tragic fall, or something far more sinister? The Badlands National Park in South Dakota is a land of dramatic, eroded buttes and pinnacles, a place of stark beauty and ancient history. But in 1999, it became the scene of a gruesome discovery that remains unsolved. A headless, handless, and footless body was found in a remote area of the park. The victim, a woman, was never identified. The dismemberment, clearly an attempt to hinder identification, pointed to a brutal and calculated crime. Despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, including DNA analysis and forensic reconstruction, the woman's identity and the circumstances around her death remain shrouded in mystery. Sedona, Arizona, renowned for its spiritual energy and breathtaking red rock landscapes, is also a hotbed for cryptid enthusiasts. While not a national park, it borders national forest land, and within its ancient canyons, disturbing reports of Bigfoot sightings and unearthly sounds have persisted for decades. Hikers and campers have described encountering large bipedal creatures, often accompanied by strong foul odors. More unsettling are the auditory experiences, strange howls and guttural roars, and even what sounds like large objects being thrown or trees being broken. These aren't just isolated incidents. Reports are frequent and consistent, painting a picture of something powerful and elusive lurking in the shadowed canyons and dense pinyon juniper forests. Are these misidentifications, or is there a primal intelligence observing us from the wild edges of civilization? Yellowstone National Park, America's first national park, is a land of geothermal wonders. But within the historic walls of the Old Faithful Inn, it's not just the erupting hot springs that create a stir. Reports of paranormal activity have made it one of the most haunted locations in the national park system. Guests and staff have reported encounters with a spectral figure believed to be a former employee or even the hotel's original architect, Robert Reamer. Stories include unexplained footsteps in empty hallways, flickering lights, objects moving on their own, and the feeling of being watched. The most famous apparition is that of a woman in white, often seen gliding through the crow's nest area, which is an inaccessible part of the inn's attic. Is it the residual energy of lives lived and lost, or is it something more? While technically a national recreation area managed by the NPS, the Santa Monica Mountains hold a discovery that looks like a scene from a horror film. In 2016, hikers stumbled upon a meticulously constructed shrine hidden deep in the brush, complete with animal skulls, charred remains, and symbols associated with the occult. This wasn't just some teenagers playing a prank. The altar featured various animal carcasses that appeared to have been ritually sacrificed. Park rangers expressed concern not just over the illegal activity, but the potential for fire and the disturbing nature of the site. It served as a visceral reminder that for some, the deep woods aren't a place for hiking, but a sanctuary for practices that the modern world has long since tried to forget. The Great Basin National Park in Nevada is a place of ancient bristlecone pines and vast starry skies, but its history holds a dark secret, a period when indigenous people were disturbingly displayed, essentially creating a human zoo. In the early 20th century, particularly between 1900 and 1930, practices considered abhorrent today were not uncommon. Paiute and other Native American individuals were sometimes coerced or even abducted and placed in ethnological exhibits or living museums within the national park or nearby areas, including those in the Great Basin region. These displays were presented as educational, but in reality, they dehumanized indigenous people, reducing them to curiosities for the entertainment of white audiences. Yosemite National Park, despite its postcard beauty, has not been immune to brutal acts of violence. In 1984, the park was shaken by a heinous crime, the acts of two women in the remote wilderness. On March 21, 1984, friends Carol Sun and Joy Armstrong, both 16, were camping in a secluded area of the park when they were brutally attacked with an axe. The discovery of their bodies sent shockwaves through the usually tranquil park community. The investigation was extensive, leading to the eventual arrest and conviction of a transient drifter named Carrie Dean Moore. Our final disturbing entry takes us to the remote and rugged Big Bend National Park in Texas, a vast expanse of desert, mountains, and the Rio Grande. For over a century, this isolated region has been home to the mysterious Marfa Lights, but within the park itself, unexplained phenomena has also been reported. Beyond the famous Marfa Lights, which which are typically seen outside of the park, visitors deep within Big Bend have described encountering strange, unexplained lights and aerial phenomena. These aren't just distant glows. Some reports detail lights that move erratically, change color, or even appear to interact with the landscape, defying conventional explanation. In such a vast and sparsely populated area, the darkness amplifies every anomaly. Are these atmospheric conditions, secret government tests, or something far more unusual? The silent, ancient landscape of Big Bend holds its secrets close, occasionally offering a glimpse of the truly inexplicable.
So this whole thing started as a pretty standard investigation in late 2025. Police in Northern California were looking into a property over some illegal green growing. Nothing crazy on the surface, just another property they were checking out. But then they found the entrance. It wasn't inside a building or anything obvious like that. It was a tunnel around 100 feet long, running through what was basically a big concrete pipe. You had to go through the whole thing just to get to what was at the other end, and what was at the other end was a bunker. Proper one. It had power, ventilation, drainage, real flooring. Someone actually knew what they were doing when they built this thing. Once investigators got inside, they realized pretty fast this was a much more serious operation than they thought, because the bunker was packed with firearms and thousands of rounds of ammo. Some of the weapons had their serial numbers removed. Others have been reported stolen years before. The guy who owned the property, Michael Kemfold, got arrested, ended up facing a long list of weapons charges. In 2013, some researchers went down into an old abandoned Soviet nuclear bunker in western Poland. The place had been sealed since the early 90s. It was just empty concrete rooms that had been sitting in complete darkness for over 20 years. While they were walking around, they started noticing ants. A few at first, then more. There were so many that it looked like parts of the floor were actually moving. But there was no reason for ants to be there. Nothing grows there. There's nothing to eat. So they started looking around to try and figure out where they were coming from. Eventually, they traced it back to a rusted ventilation pipe up in the ceiling. Above that pipe was a normal ant colony living up top. Over time, the metal had rotted just enough that ants were falling through it and dropping down into the bunker below. And once they were down there, they couldn't get back out. What researchers pieced together is that this wasn't really a colony in any normal sense. There was no queen down there. The ants on the floor were just the ones that had fallen in and gotten stuck. The only reason any of them were still alive was because of what was already covering parts of the ground. Dead ants piled up. The living ones were eating them. This one stayed hidden for decades, sitting right next to some of the most visited beaches in Normandy. In 2006, a guy named Gary Stern bought an old World War II map off a former US soldier. The map pointed to something buried between Omaha and Utah Beach, so he went out to see what was actually there. At some point, he was walking around and he felt concrete under his feet all of a sudden. He pushed through some overgrown bushes and found an entrance that had been completely buried. Once he got inside, it opened up into a full underground complex. Not just one room. Tunnels, storage rooms, living spaces, even a small hospital. It was part of something called the Macy Battery, a military position that was built for D-Day. After the invasion, it got abandoned and nature slowly swallowed it up. When people finally explored it decades later, rooms were completely untouched. Equipment was still sitting there. The whole layout was basically frozen in time. One explorer described it as a, quote, strange feeling, a somber, dark experience. But people had been walking those beaches for years, decades, and the whole time, this massive bunker was right underneath their feet. Some forestry workers up in southern Scotland were out cutting down trees when they came across an old iron door set in the ground. That was weird enough that someone called in archaeologists. What they found was a forgotten World War II bunker. It was part of a whole network of secret shelters built in case Britain got invaded during the war. Specifically built for special guerrilla units, guys who were trained to hide, wait, then slip out at night, and cause as much chaos as possible behind enemy lines if an invasion happened. The bunker was around 23 feet long and about 10 feet wide, buried under a couple feet of earth, with a thick iron hatch on top and an escape hatch that had been filled in at some point. When they got inside, it was mostly empty, just a rusted tin can and some bits of what looked like an old wooden bed. Originally, it would have been stocked with bunks, supplies, enough gear to last 2 weeks. Sean and Carrie Tullier bought a house on the island of Guernsey, off the coast of France. They knew that the land had been used by occupying forces during World War II, but nobody thought there might be an actual bunker buried under their driveway. The tip came from someone who used to live there back in March of 2022. Sean said, "From the outside, you could tell it was sitting on top of something. We've been doing up the house anyway, so I hired a digger, and with the help of a mate, we started digging up the driveway to see what was there. After a while, the ground gave way and a doorway appeared. Inside was a really solid underground structure. 2 main rooms, one about 17 by 10 feet, the other 17 by 20. Tiled floors, an escape hatch, and German writing all over the walls. One of the phrases translated to "Beware, the enemy is listening." They also found old tins and bits of debris left behind. The couple decided to turn it into a games room and gym, but according to Sean, quote, "It's not just a games room. People come along and ask to see the history. I know it was a bad time for Guernsey during the occupation, but I do find the history fascinating. I think we need to keep it so we remember what happened." In 2024, a family in Southwick, England had been living in their house for 3 years without having any idea there was a World War II bunker sitting under their garden the whole time. It only came out when they started doing some work in the backyard. Catherine Milburn, one of the homeowners, said they were digging around when they hit something strange under a summer house. She said, "There's about a 3-meter long piece of concrete underneath the summer house in the garden. We noticed steel bars. We thought it was a bit over the top for a summer house. Then we got to a corrugated iron sheet. They kept digging into the night and eventually found steps going down into a water-filled tunnel. Turned out this is a wartime air raid shelter. Historians think that what they found is what's called an Anderson shelter, a specific type of shelter that was buried in people's backyards to protect families from air raids during the war. Very few of these things are still around. Millions were installed before and during the war, but most got filled in or dug up afterward. Finding one intact is genuinely rare. And here's a similar case. Over in Kent, England, a woman named Rebecca Hobson wasn't exactly planning on making a big historical discovery in her own backyard, but it was 2020, this was the lockdown, and she had more time on her hands, and she ended up getting into talking with some neighbors about an old concrete slab sitting in her garden. People in the area had been saying for a while that there might be something underneath it, so she lifted it up. What she found wasn't just some old cellar, it was the entrance to a 160-foot underground bomb shelter built during World War II, also used to shelter people during air raids. Rebecca hasn't gone into a lot of detail about exactly what's inside, but just the fact that something this big had been sitting under a regular backyard for decades without anyone knowing, it says a lot. There's a huge amount of history still buried under totally normal homes and gardens across England, and nobody even knows most of it is there. In 2013, in Midland City, Alabama, police were dealing with a 65-year-old man named Jimmy Lee Dykes. He'd shot a school bus driver, grabbed a young boy off the bus, dragging him down into a bunker he dug under his property. The space was tiny, maybe 6 by 8 feet, reinforced, and he'd rigged it with at least one explosive. Negotiators were trying to communicate with him through a PVC pipe that he'd run into the bunker, basically using it as a kind of line to the outside world without him having to come out. Police figured out he had food, electricity, and a TV down there. He was set up to hold out for a long time if he wanted to. The standoff went on for almost a week. Eventually, tactical teams went in. There was a brief exchange of fire. Dykes was killed, and the boy was thankfully rescued unharmed. Under the grounds of Scarborough Castle in North Yorkshire, England, archaeologists found a Cold War bunker that had been completely lost for decades. The castle sits overlooking the town, and buried underneath was this reinforced concrete shelter built in the 60s. It was meant to protect Royal Observer Corps volunteers in the event of a nuclear attack. Kevin Booth from English Heritage said, "Wherever you lived in Britain, you were probably no more than a few miles from an ROC post, yet few people knew they existed. It seems strange to have a Cold War bunker built inside Scarborough Castle, but in many ways, it is a perfect location." End quote. The dig started on March 7th after survey data suggested something was hidden under the castle. Once they opened it up and sent cameras in, they found cramped bunks, communication equipment, and just enough room for a small group of volunteers to ride out a nuclear blast while tracking what was happening above ground. This is one of around 1,500 bunkers like it across the UK, and most of them have been forgotten. The Royal Observer Corps had over 20,000 volunteers whose whole job was monitoring atomic explosions, and the general public barely knew any of it existed. Booth also pointed out something really cool about the location. That land has been used as a lookout point for thousands of years, going back to the Bronze Age. This involves a real Egyptian tomb object, but what made it famous happened much later. So the statue is a small carved figure called the Shabti. meant to act as a servant for the dead in the afterlife. This specific one dates back to around 1800 BCE and was originally placed inside a burial. It's been sitting in the Manchester Museum in England for decades, but in 2013, staff noticed it had turned slightly inside its display case. The case was locked, so they checked security and didn't see anyone had touched it. That's when they set up a time-lapse camera. And over a few days, the footage showed the statue slowly rotating on its own, turning about 180 degrees. Other objects in the same case hadn't moved at all. A physicist later said vibrations from people walking nearby could cause the base to shift, especially since the statue has a slightly uneven bottom, but even with that explanation, it couldn't fully explain why it only rotated once and stayed in that new position. Turns out a very famous Egyptian pharaoh had a dagger made of space rock. In 2016, when researchers published a study on the tested blade of King Tut, they found it contained around 10% nickel along with cobalt, and that combination matches iron meteorites, not iron produced on Earth. At the time the dagger was made, around 1300 BCE, Egyptians didn't have iron smelting technology yet. Most tools were bronze. Iron objects from that period are extremely rare and usually come from meteorites. Ancient Egyptian texts actually refer to iron as metal from the sky. The dagger also shows high craftsmanship. The blade is smooth and polished, and the gold handle is decorated with all this intricate detail. I don't think there's anything really cooler than having a dagger forged from space metal. So in 2005, a new tomb turned up in the Valley of the Kings, which is already surprising because that place has been explored for centuries. People have been digging there forever, so finding something nobody had touched, that was a big deal on its own. And it was sitting right next to some major royal tombs, so naturally, everyone assumed it was going to be another important burial. They got inside and found 7 wooden coffins and over 20 large storage jars, all of it sealed. Nobody'd been in there since ancient times. And then they opened the coffins, and there was nothing in them. No bones, nothing. What they found instead was all the stuff you'd use to prepare a mummy. Linen wrappings, jars with embalming waste in them, used bandages. So this wasn't a burial chamber for a person, it was more like a storage room. But the coffins were fully built and sealed, ready to go. They just never had anyone placed inside them. Either they were built in advance as extras, or they got repurposed at some point and then just left there. Nobody ever came back for them. In 2018, construction workers in Alexandria were digging when they hit this giant black granite sarcophagus about 5 meters underground. The thing weighed around 30 tons, no inscriptions anywhere on it, which is strange. The ancient Egyptians were kind of known for marking things, so you'd think something this huge would have had some sort of inscription. It was also completely sealed, so people started wondering. Maybe it was someone important, maybe royalty, maybe there was treasure in there. When they opened it, there were just 3 skeletons inside, sitting in this dark reddish-brown liquid. Turned out it was a lovely soup of decomposed organic material mixed with groundwater that leaked in over time. One of the skulls also had a small hole in it. Researchers think that may have come from an arrow, so at least one of these people possibly died violently. But there were no artifacts, nothing really explaining who they were or why they ended up in the same coffin. Based on the style of the sarcophagus though, it's probably from somewhere between 305 and 30 BCE. That's genuinely all anyone really knows. The Screaming Mummy has to be one of the most immediately terrifying archaeological finds in history. I mean, it's a mummified man with a permanent look of agony on his face. The mummy is also called Unknown Man E. His identity was unknown for a long time, but then in 2012, researchers did CT scans and DNA testing and found he was closely related to Ramses III, most likely his son Pentawere. Historical records mention a plot to kill Ramses III, and Pentawere was one of the people named in it. Him being the Screaming Mummy would make sense. His burial was completely different from what you'd expect for a royal. He was not properly embalmed. Instead of clean linen, he was wrapped in sheepskin. In ancient Egypt, sheepskin was considered impure. Combine that with his pained expression, and this all starts looking very intentional. Every other royal mummy was prepared to look peaceful and dignified. This one clearly wasn't. The burial method, the wrappings, the condition of the body, all points to someone being denied a proper burial as part of their punishment. Found in 1817 in the Valley of the Kings by an Italian archaeologist and explorer named Giovanni Belzoni, The tomb of Seti I is one of the most detailed royal tombs ever found. You could study this place for years and keep noticing new details. I mean, look how covered everything is. The walls are not just decorated, they're packed with full religious texts. The Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates, the Amdua. These were basically instruction manuals for getting through the afterlife. It's laid out step by step. Gates with guards, specific things the king needed to say to pass through, scenes showing what happens to people who don't make it. It reads like a literal map of where to go and what to do. The ceiling has the night sky mapped out on it, tied into the journey through the underworld. Compared to other tombs, the quality here is noticeably higher. Deeper carvings, a better preserved paint, more complete texts. It would be absolutely insane getting to walk through this place, which you can. It is open to tourists. A lot of what we know about tombs doesn't come from the tombs themselves. Some of it comes from paperwork, specifically records about tomb robberies. There's one called the Abbot Papyrus from around 1100 BCE, which is basically an official government report documenting investigations into break-ins, which tombs were hit, what was taken. And then there's the first papyrus, which has actual confessions in it. One guy describes going into a royal tomb with a group, cracking open the burial chamber and stripping gold straight off the coffin and the body, pulling off jewelry, tearing apart the wrappings, and then splitting everything up between the group after. These were statements taken during interrogations. People got beaten for it, some were executed, and I don't know, it's just cool that we have pretty detailed reports on some of these ancient heists. In 1907, a tomb was found near a town called Raifa with two coffins inside, side by side. They belonged to two men, Kum Nakht and Nakht Ankh. Inscriptions said they were brothers, buried together around 1800 BCE. And that was the story for over 100 years. In 2018, though, researchers ran DNA tests on both mummies. Turns out they had the same mother, but different fathers. They were half-brothers, not full siblings. Inscriptions actually mention their mother, but are kind of vague about their father, which in hindsight lines up with the results. The family situation was apparently more complicated than just two brothers. Both men were still buried with equal care, though. Well-made coffins, properly prepared bodies. There was no sign that one was treated better than the other despite the different fathers. For a long time, nobody could pin down where Thutmose II was originally buried. His mummy had been found, but it was in a cache with other royal remains, meaning it had been moved at some point. The actual tomb was a mystery. Recently, though, researchers working on a damaged tomb in the Valley of the Kings found inscriptions and fragments connected to him. The tomb had been hit with flooding over the years, which wiped out or scattered most of what was inside, but pieces of stone with his name on them and bits of burial equipment were enough to make the identification. The layout also matched what you'd expect from a ruler of that period, the early 18th dynasty. The tomb was mostly empty, though, probably looted a long time ago, and the flooding took care of a lot of what was left. Egyptian burial sites are full of mummified animals: cats, birds, crocodiles, dogs, millions of them. Most weren't pets, they were religious offerings, things people would buy and leave at temples or burial sites as gifts to the gods. Now, the assumption for a long time was that each wrapped up mummy had a complete animal inside, but when researchers started scanning them with x-rays and CT scans, found that a lot of them don't. Some have only a few bones. Some have random stuff inside, feathers, sticks, bits of different animals maybe. Some have no animal bits at all, just linen wrapped into a shape that looks like an animal. A 2015 study found that a big chunk of the ones they scanned fell into those categories. And the conclusion? Seems that a lot of these were being mass-produced, not always carefully prepared. So instead of rare, carefully made offerings, a lot of these were basically churned out to keep up with demand. People still believed in what they were doing. It was still a genuine religious practice, just not quite as carefully crafted as everyone believed. In 1918, a French soldier named Hubert Rochereau was killed in action during World War I. His parents were so devastated by the loss that they turned his bedroom into a shrine, and they wanted it to stay that way forever. So eventually, they just bricked up the door, and the room stayed sealed behind that wall for 102 years. When it was finally opened, it was like stepping straight into another time. Everything was, and still is by the way, exactly where Hubert left it. His pipe is still sitting on his desk next to a tin of tobacco, and his old books are lined up on the shelves. His military uniform and medals are still hanging up, just buried under a century of thick dust. Their parents had sold the place in 1935, but they added a clause to the contract. The room wasn't to be touched for 500 years, and every person who's owned the home since has respected the parents' wish and left the room alone. The current owner, Laurent Laroche, treats the space with a lot of weight, saying, quote, "It's not a museum, it's a place where someone lived and who's still there in some way. He was a young man who died for his country, and his parents wanted to keep his memory alive." A few years ago, about 50 feet down a shaft in the Saqqara graveyard, a team of archaeologists found a massive 45-ton limestone coffin that had been sealed shut with mortar for 4,300 years. It was completely untouched. Looters never even smelled the place. When they finally opened it, they found a mummy named Cachepus. The guy was literally head to toe in gold leaf. It's pretty rare to find an old kingdom mummy that hasn't been picked clean by grave robbers, let alone one this well preserved. They also found tombs for other big names nearby, including a guy whose actual job title was Keeper of Secrets. Zahi Owas, who was leading the dig, talked about sticking his head into the coffin for the first time, saying, "I put my head inside to see what was inside the sarcophagus, a beautiful mummy of a man completely covered in layers of gold." He also mentioned that this, quote, may be the oldest and most complete mummy found in Egypt to date. Back in 1966, a group of farmers in the Yucatan told an archaeologist named Victor Segovia Pinto about a cave they'd found. Segovia checked it out, realized it was packed with ancient artifacts, and then just shut it down. He had the entrance sealed with rocks and basically wiped the discovery from the official records. For over 50 years, the cave stayed hidden under the jungle floor. It wasn't until 2019 that Guillermo Dianda and his team tracked it down. To get inside, they had to crawl on their stomachs through cramped tunnels full of freezing mud for hours. Eventually reached a series of chambers that hadn't been touched in about 1,000 years. The place is called Balunku, the Cave of the Jaguar God. It's a massive underground time capsule. There are over 150 items in there, mostly incense burners and ritual plates. A lot of these burners have the face of a god named Tlaloc on them, which is pretty interesting because Tlaloc was a rain god from central Mexico, hundreds of miles away from this Maya site. Maya didn't just toss these things in a pile either. They carefully wedged them into rock crevices or placed them around the stalagmites. Archaeologists think they did this during a massive drought, dragging these heavy ceramic pots through miles of tight, muddy tunnels as a last-ditch effort for water. When Diana finally broke through into the main chamber, he was overwhelmed, saying, quote, "I couldn't speak, I started to cry. I've analyzed human remains in Chichen Itza's sacred cenote, but nothing compares to the sensation I had entering alone for the first time in that cave," end quote. In 1994, 3 speleologists led by Jean-Marie Chauvet were poking around the cliffs of southern France when they felt a weird, faint draft coming from a pile of rocks. They cleared some space, squeezed through a tight passage, and ended up dropping into this massive chamber that had been completely cut off from the world for 30,000 years. The floor was covered in bones and skulls of extinct cave bears, and not only that, the walls were covered in hundreds of paintings of lions, rhinos, and mammoths. The artists actually used the humps and curves of the cave walls to make the animals look more three-dimensional. Because a landslide had sealed the entrance so perfectly, the cave was a total vacuum. There were even footprints from a young child and a wolf preserved in the clay floor, looking like they'd been stepped in just hours before the explorers arrived. Jean-Marie Chauvet said the light of our lamps fell on a giant mammoth drawn in red ochre on a rocky pendant. We were gripped by a strange feeling. Everything was so beautiful, so fresh, almost too much so. The Great Pyramid of Giza is famously empty, but in 1872 a British engineer named Wayneman Dixon was poking around the Queen's chamber when he found 3 specific items stashed in a shaft that had been sealed for thousands of years. These are the Dixon relics, a bronze hook, a stone ball, and some small fragments of cedar wood. While the first 2 ended up in a museum, the wood just disappeared for over a century. Turns out the wood had been passed around until it ended up at the University of Aberdeen, where it was lost in their massive archives. In 2019, a woman named Abir Eldani, an Egyptian archaeologist, is from roughly 3341 to 3094 BCE, which is actually hundreds of years older than most people think the pyramid is. Curtis, the museum head, said the university's collections are vast, running to hundreds of thousands of items, so looking for it has been like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Eldani was stunned by the luck of it too, saying, "I'm an archaeologist and have worked on digs in Egypt, but I never imagined it would be here in northeast Scotland. I would find something so important to the heritage of my own country." In 2022, in the Polish village of Barczesko, archaeologists were poking around the ruins of a 14th century church when they found a bricked-up tunnel that had been sealed off for ages. The church was destroyed during a war in 1354, and since then, the entrance had been completely hidden underground. When they finally broke through the blockage, they found a small vaulted crypt, and inside the cramped space, they discovered the remains of 2 people. But the real mystery was the pile of silver coins scattered around them, thin, one-sided coins that were common in the Middle Ages. It was clear that someone was desperately trying to hide their wealth before the church was leveled. The coins and the skeletons were left exactly as they fell hundreds of years ago. Deep in a Polish forest, a group of amateur historians was poking around the ruins of a massive military compound known as the Wolf's Lair. This was the ultra-secure forest fortress where the leader of the Third Reich, the guy with the famous tiny mustache, spent most of his time during the 40s. After scanning the dirt under what used to be the floor of Hermann Göring's private villa, the team dug down and found 5 skeletons buried just inches below where the floorboards would have been. There were 3 adults and 2 younger people, and all of them were missing their hands and feet. Now, because of some delightfully strict platform rules that treat certain historical words like Voldemort for some reason, we can't name the specific political party or their leader, but I think you all know who I'm talking about. And the fact that 5 people were buried under the house of the second in command of that regime is disturbing, but not really all that surprising. The bodies actually predated the Third Reich, though, so the team actually believes they may have had a possible connection to occult practices, which, as many of you probably know, the regime partly spawned out of and remained interested in throughout their reign. The Crypt of Civilization is this giant time capsule built with one goal in mind: outlast all of us. It's meant to stay sealed for over 6,000 years, not opening until the year 8113. It was locked up back in 1940 at Oglethorpe University by a historian named Thornwell Jacobs, who got the idea after people started cracking open ancient sites like the Egyptian pyramids. He basically thought, why not leave something behind for whoever's around thousands of years from now? So inside the vault is a little bit of everything from the time, stuff meant to show what everyday life looked like in the early 1900s. Books, films, typewriters, sewing machines, cash registers. They also packed in audio recordings of speeches and radio broadcasts, figuring future people might be curious about how we sounded, how we talked. Now, what's funny, obviously, in hindsight, is they had no clue the internet was coming, so all that effort to preserve information, and now most of it already exists in the digital realm. But then again, 6,000 years, it's a long time, a lot can change. No one knows who or even what will be around by then. For all we know, everything we've built could be wiped out, and the vault ends up being one of the only things left behind. In Denmark, a team of researchers was digging through a Viking burial ground that had been sitting untouched underground for more than 1,000 years. They were pulling up old bones and corroded tools when they found something that had absolutely no business being there. It was a small glass bottle buried in the dirt. Inside was a handwritten note. Is it a treasure map? An ancient Viking poem? Well, no. It was just a letter from a local guy named Hans, who'd worked on that exact same site back in 1895. He'd buried it on purpose as a little hello to whoever came back to finish the dig one day. It's a strange thing to find. Here are these modern archaeologists surrounded by graves from the Viking Age. They're holding a 130-year-old letter from someone who was standing in the same spot doing the same work over a century before them. The note mentioned details from the original excavation and even named some of the people who were part of it. One of the archaeologists described holding it as a very special feeling, knowing that the person who wrote it was standing right there where he was standing more than 100 years earlier. Another pointed out just how unusual that kind of connection is. Their whole job is dealing with people who've been dead for, 1,000 years, so getting a note from someone who died only just over a century ago, it almost felt recent in comparison. In southeastern Turkey, there's a site called Göbekli Tepe. A survey team noted it back in 1963, but it wasn't until archaeologist Klaus Schmidt started digging in 1994 that anyone understood what was actually there. What they found was enormous stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circles and carved with images of animals, snakes, foxes, and birds. The structures go back to around 9600 BCE. That's over 11,000 years ago. Thousands of years before Stonehenge, thousands of years before the pyramids. And here's the part that makes it hard to wrap your head around. When this place was built, people were still mostly hunter-gatherers. Agriculture, as we think of it, settled farms, permanent villages, it wasn't really a thing yet. The old assumption was that civilization came first, and then you got the big structures. Göbekli Tepe flips that on its head. Somehow, people without permanent settlements were organizing in large enough numbers to plan and build something like this. There's no strong evidence that anyone actually lived here, though. Best guess is that it was used for rituals or large gatherings, but they're still not exactly sure. In 2015, a farmer named James Bristol and his neighbor were digging a trench on his property in Lima Township, Michigan. They were putting in a drainage pipe about 8 feet underground when the backhoe hit something solid. They figured it was probably a rock or an old tree root, and they pulled it up. It was a bone, roughly 3 feet long. That clearly didn't come from anything living on the farm. Bristol contacted the University of Michigan Museum of Paleontology, which happened to be about 10 miles away, and a team came out to take a look. Bristol gave them 1 day. He had farming work to get back to, so they moved quickly, and what they found was a partial skeleton of a Jeffersonian mammoth, a massive animal that roamed North America until about 12,000 years ago. Michigan has had around 30 mammoth finds over the years, but this one was especially well preserved. They dug up the whole skull with its gigantic tusks. Incredibly cool find. Old cities have a habit of building right on top of their own history. In places like New York, construction crews doing underground utility work have occasionally broken through to something unexpected. Old iron safes from the 1800s, buried several feet down. This typically belonged to banks, jewelers, or other businesses. When the buildings above them were torn down, the safes were often just left behind. They were too heavy to move easily, and at the time, it wasn't worth the trouble, so workers built right over them. Most of the time when these are found and opened, they're empty, unfortunately. Whatever was inside was either cleared out before the building closed or didn't survive being underground for over a century. It's not a dramatic discovery really, but it's a good reminder of how cities work, layer after layer, generation after generation, with older pieces of the city just sitting underneath everything that came after. Along the Pan-American Highway in northern Chile, there's a stretch of land called Cerro Ballena, which means Whale Hill. In 2010, workers expanding the road started uncovering fossilized whale skeletons. When researchers came in to investigate, they found over 40 whales, along with bones from other creatures, all in the same area. The fossils are between 6 and 9 million years old. What caught scientists' attention was how the skeletons were positioned. A lot of them were lined up in similar directions, which seems to suggest they didn't just drift in randomly. Something happened to a large number of animals at once, repeatedly. Leading theory is toxic algae blooms. These blooms can poison marine life, and if they happened multiple times in the same area, groups of whales could have died and then washed ashore together. Ireland's peat bogs are usually good at preserving things. The environment is cold, low oxygen, and slow to break things down, which is why people have pulled wooden tools, clothing, and even human bodies out of them in remarkable condition. In 2016, a man cutting turf found a large waxy lump buried underground. It weighed around 22 pounds and turned out to be something called bog butter, which is literally just butter found in bogs. It was roughly 2,000 years old. In ancient Ireland, butter was buried in bogs for different reasons. To store it, to hide it, or possibly as some kind of offering. The reasoning isn't always clear. What is clear, though, is that even after all that time underground, the chemical structure of the fat is still pretty much the same. The smell is apparently a totally different story, though. Not anything you'd want near your food. After World War II, not every tank and armored vehicle got stored in a museum or melted down for scrap. Some of them were just buried. Across parts of the UK, construction workers and farmers have dug up tanks and other military equipment, sometimes only a few feet below the surface. In many cases, they were buried on purpose. It's just the fastest way to clear land after the war ended. Pulling them out wasn't seen as worth the effort. So some vehicles were used in training exercises or testing and got stuck or damaged badly enough that moving them just wasn't practical. The solution: push them into the ground and move on. Stuff grew over the pits over time, and eventually they looked like nothing more than a slightly uneven patch of field. So when this stuff suddenly shows up during construction, it's almost always a surprise. A seemingly completely ordinary piece of land turns out to have a World War II tank sitting right underneath it. At the very northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, there's a place called Lands aux Meadows. In the 60s, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad went to investigate some unusual mounds that locals had noticed in the landscape. What they uncovered were the remains of Norse buildings, sod houses, a workshop, signs of metalworking. The site dates to around the year 1000. This was the confirmation that Norse explorers had reached North America about 500 years before Columbus. Everything had been slowly covered by layers of soil and grass over the years, blending into the landscape well enough that nothing looked out of place from the surface. The site appears to have been used only for a short period of time, which actually helped preserve it. There just wasn't much later building or activity on top of it to disturb what was already there. In 1996, archaeologist Zahi Hawass made a major discovery in Egypt's Bahariya oasis. The site became known as the Valley of the Golden Mummies. The burials date to the Greco-Roman period, around 2,000 years ago. What's been found there so far includes hundreds of mummies, many of them decorated with gold, particularly on their faces. These were not pharaohs or royalty, though. They appear to just be middle or upper class people who had the extra money for more elaborate burials. The tombs are connected through a series of underground chambers and passageways, and they're still digging there to this day. A lot of researchers think there could be way more burials hidden underground. Some estimates get pretty high, but nothing's been fully confirmed yet. Even so, what they've already found makes it one of the biggest mummy discoveries in Egypt's history. In the early 2000s, coal miners working in an open pit mine in Colombia started turning up fossils. Some of the vertebrae they found were bigger than anything on record. Scientists eventually identified the remains as belonging to a snake called Titanoboa. It lived around 60 million years ago, shortly after the dinosaurs went extinct. And based on the fossils, it was about 13 meters long, or roughly 42 feet. That makes it the largest snake ever discovered. Some say these things could have even reached like 50 feet. Snakes are cold-blooded, which means their body size is directly tied to how warm their environment is. The hotter the climate, the larger they can grow. So safe to say it was pretty hot there back in Titanoboa's day. It lived in a dense, swampy, tropical environment, and over millions of years, the landscape slowly compressed and turned into coal. That's why its fossils ended up buried so deep, only showing up once miners started cutting into those layers. Archaeologists in Italy found something that almost never happens anymore, an ancient tomb that grave robbers never got to. Most tombs from this period were cleaned out centuries ago. You walk in, there's basically nothing left. Maybe some broken pottery, bones here and there, whatever the looters didn't want, but this one had a massive stone slab still blocking the entrance, exactly where it had been placed around 2,600 years ago. When researchers finally moved it and went inside, 4 skeletons were lying on carved stone beds, and surrounding them were over 100 objects: iron weapons, bronze decorations, ceramic jars, all of it sitting right where someone had placed it in the 7th century BCE. The tomb belonged to the Etruscans, the civilization that occupied Italy before Rome took over. Historians actually relied heavily on tombs to understand them because the Etruscans didn't leave behind a lot of written records. Finding one completely untouched, though, was almost unheard of. Archaeologist Davide Zori, who worked on the excavation, called it a, quote, unique opportunity for our project to study the beliefs and burial traditions of this fascinating pre-Roman culture. A couple years ago, also in Italy, archaeologists opened a Roman tomb near Naples that had been sealed for close to 2,000 years. Parts of what was inside still look surprisingly fresh. They nicknamed it the Tomb of Cerberus after a large painted image on the wall, Cerberus being the 3-headed dog from Roman mythology that guarded the entrance to the underworld. The tomb was found during work in an old burial area that dated back to the Roman Empire, and when researchers went inside, they found burial niches built into the walls with artifacts nobody had touched since the 2nd century. And then the thing that really caught everyone off guard, a body lying on a stone bed that had partially mummified on its own. Hair and parts of the skin were still there. The tomb had stayed sealed tightly enough for so long that moisture barely got in, so that's what kept everything preserved. In France, a team restoring an old medieval church found something nobody expected when they pulled up the floor, a hidden staircase that led down into a sealed burial vault. The church had been in rough shape for years because of a bad renovation in the 70s. Workers back then had installed a heated concrete floor inside, which trapped moisture and salt underneath it, and over time the stones started breaking apart. While crews were digging down to figure out how bad the damage was, they hit the staircase. Went down into a vault that had been shut for at least 400 years, and inside were dozens of people buried in wooden coffins, adults and children mixed together. What researchers noticed pretty quickly was that the space had been used over and over again across different generations. As newer burials were added, older bones had been pushed to the sides to clear the room. Archaeologists think the vault may have filled up fast during some kind of disaster, a famine, disease maybe, and the deeper they went, the further back in time they went. Underneath the vault, they found stone coffins going back roughly 1,500 years. Construction workers in Hungary were digging near an old Roman cemetery when they hit a massive stone coffin, several tons of carved limestone that's been sealed shut for about 1,700 years. Researchers could tell right away it was not an ordinary burial. The coffin had been built and sealed with real care, and parts of it had been reinforced with metal clamps and lead to keep air and moisture out. Since most Roman burials like this were looted long ago, the team figured it would probably be empty. Wasn't. Inside were the remains of a young woman, along with glass bottles, jewelry, amber beads, bronze objects, iron nails, and fabric woven with gold thread. Traces of red pigment and decorative plaster were still preserved inside the coffin walls. Researcher Zsolt Mrav described it as, quote, one of the most extraordinary Roman period burials ever found in Budapest. The team is still examining everything to work out who she was and why she had such an elaborate burial. Researchers working in the ancient city of Petra, Jordan, had suspected for a long time that there were hidden chambers beneath the treasury. Using ground-penetrating radar, they picked up something underground, and when they finally got permission to dig, they found a sealed chamber that hadn't been opened in around 2,000 years. Inside was a tomb with the remains of 12 people, along with bronze items, iron tools, pottery, and ceramics spread around the chamber exactly where they'd been left. One of the ceramic pieces, a cup, drew a lot of attention because it looked kind of similar to the Holy Grail prop from Indiana Jones. What made this find stand out was its condition. Most burial chambers in Petra had been emptied out over time. This one was still completely intact, basically untouched since it was sealed. Archaeologists digging in northern Egypt found something buried in the courtyard of an ancient royal palace that was hard to make sense of at first, and it was grim. There were 3 pits filled with severed right hands, and not just a few, at least 12 in total. Again, all right hands, deliberately placed in pits directly in front of what used to be a throne room. The site dates to roughly 1640 to 1530 BCE. The fingers were often spread out, palms facing different directions, like someone had arranged them before putting them in the ground. Most belonged to adult males, though one may have come from a female, so that was kinda odd too. Why only one female? When they looked at the cuts, they were clean. They weren't hacked off in a hurry, so these were taken carefully, probably pretty soon after death, not dug up from old graves or anything like that either. The working theory is that it was some kind of ritual, maybe a way of presenting defeated enemies as trophies, but nobody's landed on a definitive answer quite yet. Archaeologists in southern Norway were scanning farmland with ground-penetrating radar when something showed up in the data that did not look natural. The shape was too clean, it was too deliberate. The more they looked at it, the more it looked like a ship, and it turned out that they were right. Underneath the soil was a Viking ship burial that had been sitting there for over 1,000 years. The wood was long gone, but the shape of the hull was still perfectly readable in the dirt, traced out by iron nails still sitting exactly where they'd been hammered in. The mound that would have originally sat on top had been worn flat by centuries of farming, which is probably why nobody ever stumbled across it. Inside the ship's outline, researchers found signs of burial chambers and traces of objects that had been placed with whoever was buried there. Ship burials like this were not done just for anyone. It took an enormous amount of work. They were saved for high-status people. A lot of people think that Vikings were all buried like this, which would be awesome. It just wasn't the case. What got researchers excited was how clearly the whole thing had survived underground even after the wood rotted away. The full layout, it was still there. It was like an outline pressed into the earth. In the Venice Lagoon, researchers had been suspicious for decades that something man-made was sitting on the bottom. Surveys back in the 80s had picked up what looked like structures down there, but nobody could say for sure what they were. Well, that changed in 2021 when a geophysicist named Fantina Madricardo published a study using high-resolution sonar mapping, finally confirmed there is a Roman road down there, stretching for over 1,100 meters, or just over 3,600 feet. Divers went down to check and found the actual paving stones, called basili, which are the big, heavy stones Romans used to build their roads. Smooth on top, curved at the bottom. 2,000 years ago, this was dry land, a sandy ridge that people actually walked and traveled on. Since then, sea levels in the lagoon have risen about 2.5 meters, and the whole route went underwater. Along with the road, the team found massive foundations nearby, some close to 9 feet tall and 170 feet long. And they think that they were part of a harbor or a dock. Researchers said that the, quote, presence of the ancient Roman road confirms that there were permanent settlements in the area centuries before the foundation of Venice. So, long before Venice existed as a city, this part of the lagoon was a busy place with roads, ports, and people moving goods around. So the history of the area goes back a lot further than most people realize.